knock that. And then we'll talk about a couple reminders, make sure we're all on the same page. And then we'll get going on 11. So, and then of course, before we leave tonight, we'll talk about what next week's going to look like so everybody can be prepared for that. But we are, y'all, the end is in sight. So in our kind of our closing attorney unit, kind of their process, the things to consider. There's we talked about deeds last night, specifically the assurance that the deeds offer, with the general warranty deed having the most assurance, down to some that don't have any at all. So the different deeds for the different purposes, again, being familiar with that they do different things. So now we're kind of moving ahead, and we still haven't quite gotten to the closing attorney's role yet, but we're talking about things that they consider, things that are important in this unit. So now the question's on the table. I have to pay taxes when I sell my property. Shake your head, yes or no. Is that true or false? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. They tax you when you buy it. They tax you while you own it. And guess what? They got one more opportunity to tax you when you sell it. And when you sell it, the tax on the property is called excise tax. Some of us old school people may call it revenue stamps. All the same thing. It's a tax on the seller. So it's going to be a charge to the seller, debit the seller. And it's a tax on the seller when they go to sell their property. To calculate excise tax, it is one very simple calculation. So to calculate excise tax, we're going to take the purchase price, the sales price, the price that the buyer and the seller agree to, and we're going to divide it by 100 or 500. So we're going to take the purchase price divided by 500. If when you divide that by 500, you get change, then we need to round up to the nearest whole dollar. Excise tax is always a whole dollar, and you always round up. Did everybody hear my absolute word there? Take everything you thought you knew about rounding when it comes to excise tax. So if we calculate it and I get $400.01, we're going to round up to 401. This is the government we're talking about. So we're always going to round up. Then they have this extra step of multiplying by a dollar. And quite frankly, all that does is put the dollar sign in front of it. So as long as you know that this is a charge to the seller, all you have to do is take the purchase price, divide by 500, and then round up to the nearest whole dollar. And that will be a debit to the seller at closing. That's part of their closing costs. Y'all got your calculators ready? Got your chats up? Tell me in a chat, what would this seller's excise tax be? So let's see what we got. I got a property listed at 350. It has an assessed value at 325 and it sells for 360. Boy, that's a lot of numbers right there, isn't it? But I only care about one, right? Which one do I care about?
Seller.
The sales price. Yep. the 360, the purchase price. So we're going to take that purchase price of 360,000, divide by 500, and I get a debit the seller at closing $720 in excise tax. Nothing else to do, because once you have a whole number, that's where we end. That wasn't too bad, was it? All right. You know me, I like to have fun. Do another one. Tell me in the chat what this seller is going to pay for excise tax. Welcome. So now we have a property selling for 288,900. Seller's paying 3,000 in closing costs. How much excise tax? Do I care about that closing cost? Nope, because it's only based off of the purchase price. So 288,900 divided by 500 gives me something with change, 577.80. And no matter what that change is, we always round up and have a charge to the seller of $578. Purchase price divided by 500. If you divide by 500 and you get change, round up to the nearest whole dollar. Oh, I didn't catch that. It's a good point. We're all wrong. Every single one of us. The answer is 0. Good job. Why is it 0?
Because it's the buyer.
Because it asked about a
It's
buyer.
Dang it, because it asked about the buyer. I didn't even catch that as many times as I looked at it. But pretending that it did ask about the seller, because that's what it's going to ask you. I think they just did that to be mean. Pretending that that said buyer or seller. Now I'm almost up. Pretending that said seller, that would be 578.
Let me guess, Tyler was the one that called it.
No.
Actually, I got that wrong.
It was Stephanie.
Oh, wow. I'm so shocked.
Good job. I did that on purpose to show you guys the importance of making sure you read the question. No. Questions on excise tax? All right. Some states, maybe some counties have something called a transfer tax. I don't know of many counties here in North Carolina that does, but it's a county by county thing. Found more often in other states, but typically if there's a transfer tax, and that's going to be something on the buyer. They're going to pay for the tax to transfer the property to them. But like we said, we don't see that much in North Carolina. So what we typically deal with is the excise tax. And please make sure you have it written down that that's a seller's cost. That's something that the seller will pay as part of their closing cost. So last night when we started this discussion at the beginning of Unit 10, we were talking about a couple of different ways that you could alienate or transfer or convey property. Alienate would be separating yourself from the property. If you convey it, you're transferring it. And we said it's voluntary and involuntary. So we spent last night talking about the deed. And when you convey the property voluntarily, then you're going to do so with a deed. There's a couple other ways to transfer the property other than with a deed. Probate is another form of voluntary alienation. If somebody passes away, the reading and the dissecting of the will is called probate. So your will has dictated what you want to have happen to your property after you pass. So this would be a voluntary alienation.
Is this like the deed? I mean, not the deed, but the will? Like, does this go along with the will?
It's the process of distributing the will.
Okay.
So if we're, reading the will and saying this is who gets what, that's the process. Probate would be the process. Yep. Michael, can you hear us now? Michael, can you hear us? I guess so. If the property passes by will, he's going to log out and log back in. If the property passes by will, then that's called testate. It's the last will and testament. So if you have a will, you pass testate, the will is dissected through probate. And in most cases, I mean, not most cases, but if a deceased person's name is on the deed, then we just need a death certificate. We just need to show the attorney will probably request a death certificate showing that deceased person. So if you have spouses and one of the spouses pass away, then when they go to sell, they're going to have to produce a death certificate. Of course. Going back, let's go back just a minute for unit 2. And we talked about a couple of different forms of ownership: joint tenancy with right of survivorship, national, or tenancy by the entirety with right of survivorship. Remember what right of survivorship says? It says if 2 people have right of survivorship and one of them pass away, then the interest automatically goes to the last man standing, right? So can a will, shake your head yes or no, can a will overturn right of survivorship? And you guys are saying no, and I agree. So again, tenancy by the entirety, I think, is the best way to think about right of survivorship. So you have 2 married people, one passes away. I don't care what this person's will says, because right of survivorship says now this person owns it in severalty. Now, when this one passes away, now the will kicks in. Now we're going to determine what happened to the property. So right of survivorship or a will cannot overturn right of survivorship. Hey, Michael. Sometimes you got to log out, log back in twice, right? Whatever it takes. So we said testate is passing away without a will. Or with a will, excuse me. Intestate then is dying without a will, but you can find heirs. So testate is passing away with a will. Intestate is passing away without a will. The state may make an attempt to find heirs to pass the property to. So if they can find heirs, you don't have a will, but they might still be able to find heirs. And if that happens, then they will transfer the property by intestate succession. So testate, will, intestate, no will, but they do find heirs. How hard do they look? What's the process? I can't answer any of those questions. And then if somebody passes away, no will, and they cannot find heirs, the property goes to the state escheat. No will, no heirs. The property will go to the state. The process is escheat. And this is a form of involuntary alienation because you don't have a will to say what you want to have happen to your property. So involuntary alienation, the state will take the property and they'll either sell it or use it or, whatever, but they will take the property through escheat.
What then is cheat like when the government takes it, do they like auction it off or?
They could sell it, they could auction it off if they think that they could use it, then they could, use it for their own. So the answer is it depends. They're gonna take a hard look at it and see what they're gonna benefit most from it. A devise, after you pass away, a devise is the transfer of the real property. So devise is your real property. A bequest is the transfer of personal property. So when an individual passes, we got to do something with their stuff. The devise is dealing with the real property. The bequest is dealing with personal property. Make a note that devise and bequest is a national topic. In North Carolina, we just say devise for real property and personal property. So national uses devise and bequest to differentiate between real and personal. North Carolina just calls everything a devise, real property and personal property. So after the individual passes away, there might be an ex. I may not be able to get that word out tonight. No.
Executrix.
Executor.
Executor, thank you, and executrix, thank you. It was there, y'all saw it, right? This is the person that's been appointed in the will. So in your will, you have somebody, the executor, that is going to kind of dictate what happens, make sure that everything goes accordingly to your plans. If you don't have an executor, if you don't have this person in your, I'm done. If you don't have a person in their will, then the court may appoint somebody. They may appoint an heir, for example, and that would be an administrator. So the court may appoint somebody to execute the will. I can say that. So we may often be called to list a property where the homeowner, the individual, has passed away. So we may be dealing with the administrator or the executor. I did it. See, I don't have to think about it. So you may be dealing with, the person that is kind of in charge now that the homeowner is deceased. So if we ever get that call, we're going to be dealing with the administrator, the executor. Just make sure, and guys, this is good advice, no matter if you're dealing with an estate or not. Anytime you're getting ready to list a property, I want you guys to promise me that you'll do your due diligence and you'll go to the public records and pull the deed. Because I need you to know from the beginning that you're talking to the people that have the right and the power to sell that home. So do your due diligence. Don't trust them. Go pull public records. Your BIC will help you when you affiliate with your firm, show you how you can go out and find that information. But particularly with an estate, and again, we may just have to produce a death certificate, something like that. We can always ask the closing attorney what they may need. But a death certificate is gonna suffice. So a couple different forms. We've pretty much talked about involuntary alienation without talking about it. So we just mentioned escheat. You pass away, no will, no heirs. Another form of involuntary alienation is eminent domain. Remember, we met that back in Unit 2, and that's the governmental right to take your property for the public good. So maybe they want to widen the road in front of your house, or maybe they want to take your house and build a school or something. They do that. The eminent domain is the right. Condemnation is the process. Another involuntary alienation that we talked about in Unit 2 was adverse possession. This was when somebody's been using your land for 20 or more years and they go and claim it. You didn't voluntarily lose your property, even a portion of your property. They might just say the part you know, the corner that the fence runs on. But you're losing that property adverse possession involuntarily through court order. Another involuntary alienation is lien foreclosure. The bank's coming after the property. You're not doing this on your own accord. You're not doing this voluntarily. Questions? Again, just basic understanding. Most of what you guys are going to deal with the majority of the time is a general warranty deed. That's what we see the majority of the time. Once you start getting out of your realm, please don't ever hesitate to get your BIC involved, get your buyer seller's attorneys involved. So then the next little section, we're going to talk, now we're getting into the closing attorney's role. So talking more about that basic process of the title search, what the attorney's doing and what they're looking for. Different purposes and types of title insurance. The attorney is the one that offers their opinion of title that allows title insurance company to cover the buyer and the lender. So we're going to talk about title insurance in that process as well. So how do I know who owns a property and who has the right to sell it? Well, we all know that we can go to public records and find it. And that's exactly where the closing attorney goes as well. But the closing attorney is going to do a much deeper dive on it than what you and I will do. When I'm listing the property, all I want to see is the current deed. I want to know who owns it right now. I want to see the most recent deed. The attorney is going to do a deep dive on the title. And they're going to search this deed and the previous deed and the deed before that. They're going to go back in time to make sure that all these deeds link, all these chains in the link connect. So yes, it is a search on the public records, and technically you and I could do this. But guys, let the closing attorney do their job, because only the closing attorney can offer their opinion on the title. So you and I could search this thing all day long, but they're not going to look at us. They're not going to rely on our opinion. But again, they don't have a secret source that you and I don't have access to. They're just doing a much deeper dive on that title in those public records than what we will. So starting with the Register of Deeds, maybe down to the county or city clerk's office, you know, the GIS. I mean, anywhere you can find information about the title is what the attorney's looking for. So with title assurance versus title insurance. Title assurance gives an opinion on the title based on what is found in those publicly recorded documents. Title assurance, the opinion, is the closing attorney's responsibility. So remember last night, we went under contract, buyer's agents. We immediately send that signed contract to the lender so they can get started on the loan process. Buyer's agents, as soon as you send that signed contract to the lender, the next thing you're going to do is send that signed contract to the closing attorney. Buyer and seller have already agreed on a settlement date, so let's go ahead and get that scheduled. Yes, delays may happen, but sometimes they close on time too. So let's go ahead and get that closing or settlement scheduled for the settlement date the buyer and seller agreed to. And at some point during the process, the attorney is going to do their deep dive on the title. And if they find any issues whatsoever, then they're going to get with the seller to correct. Remember, the buyer hires the attorney. So it's the closing attorney's job to make sure that their buyer client is getting a clear marketable title. So they're going to do the deep dive if they have any problems, even if they find any problems after due diligence. It's still the responsibility of the seller to get this cleared up. It doesn't matter where in the transaction that we are. Everybody goes to settlement and brings the money they have to pay and sign the paperwork. And then when we all leave settlement, the attorney proceeds with closing. And one of the steps of closing is that the attorney offers their opinion to the title insurance company. So many attorneys that I know, before they offer their opinion, they're going to take one more quick peek at the title, one more quick peek at the public records to make sure nothing hit from when they did the deep dive a couple weeks ago, a month ago, whatever, when we went under contract. So they're just going to verify that nothing has changed since they did their deep dive. And once the attorney is satisfied that the title is clear, that the title is good, then they're going to give their opinion or their assurance of title to the title insurance company. Title insurance will not release the policy if they don't have the opinion of title from the attorney. Or if I could say that a different way, title insurance will not release the policy without title assurance. And this is for their buyer client. This is probably one of, if not the most important things, the most important roles that the closing attorney does. It's a peace of mind when you buy a property, or should be a peace of mind when you buy a property, knowing that you're starting with a clean slate, knowing that you're not starting with somebody else's stuff or somebody else's mess on title. So let's talk a little bit about title insurance. Title insurance is a policy that protects the title. Think about any other kind of insurance: automobile insurance, health insurance. Insurance kicks in when something bad happens. Yes? Title insurance kicks in if something comes up on the title that couldn't have been discovered prior to closing. So maybe there was fraud in a former deed, in a previous document, and that fraud wasn't discovered until after this closing. That's what title insurance is there to cover. Possibly encumbrances. If any encumbrances come up after closing, then title insurance may cover it. Title insurance is a one-time fee that the buyer pays for at closing. This isn't something that they have to pay, renew. You pay it one time at closing. If the buyer comes with a lender, then the lender will have a policy as well, and they let the buyer pay for that. Another one-time fee at settlement, part of the buyer's closing costs. It's going to protect the buyer for as long as they own the property. May that be 2 months or may that be 25 years. It's going to protect the buyer for as long as they own the property. It protects the lender for as long as there's an outstanding loan. The lender's policy is a diminishing policy, which means as you pay down your loan, their interest diminishes. And once you get that balance to zero, the lender's out and their policy will be removed. And now we're just protecting the buyer. So title insurance is an indemnity policy. The insurance company is going to reimburse the owner against any losses based on any title defects that were discovered after closing. So this is kind of our peace, again, our peace of mind as a homeowner. You know, we talked about, there's a really good example of something that could pop up after closing. Mechanics liens. The seller says, I'll do all this. Yeah, I'll do all these repairs. Absolutely. Where do I sign? So they agree to do the repairs. They have the repairs done, but guess what? They don't pay the mechanic. The mechanic has 120 days after the work's done to file the policy. The mechanic's lien is a specific lien, which means it attaches to
Property.
the property. So you got a brand new homeowner that's so happy because the seller agreed to do all the repairs, but guess what? They got stuck with the bill. This is the kind of thing, because guys, when we did the title search, the mechanic hadn't filed the lien yet. And this is the kind of thing that title insurance is meant to protect the current owner. I think a good way to remember title insurance, it protects the current owner from errors of the past. Things that might have affected the title before they became the owner. Protects the current owner from errors of the past. Additionally, at settlement, one of the documents that the seller signs is an affidavit from the title insurance company that says, I promise nothing can come up later and affect the title. I promise. And if anything does come up later, the title insurance very well may go after the seller or the former owner first. You signed something saying that this wouldn't happen, and it did. So I need you to make it right. And if that former owner is dead or MIA or broke, then title insurance will still protect the current owner. They're always going to protect the current owner from errors of the past.
How does it determine as far as like how much they pay?
I think it depends on whatever's going to take to clear the title. So whatever the issue is, whatever we have to do to clear that title. Because remember, you're going to want to sell it one day. So we got to take care of this now so it's not going to pop up when you go to sell it. It's insurance. It's insurance on the title in case anything goes wrong that couldn't have been discovered before closing.
And that title insurance would only pay for, like you said, mechanics lien. So like let's say it's $3,000 on a lien on the property, and then the $3,000 will be covered through the title insurance.
Whatever it takes to clear it. Yep. And they're going to make a call to the seller first. You better believe they're going to call the seller first. You know? The other thing I have to say, buyer's agents, I know that may have made you a little nervous. I hear you. Another suggestion, remember last night we looked at our due diligence request and agreement, and we might suggest that we have a licensed electrician do the work, for example. Another thing that we can do is put verbiage in there that requests to see paid in full invoices. And I think that does two things. One, it makes us feel comfortable that those repairs have been paid because we saw the invoices. But the other reason I like that, if something breaks, if that repair breaks, my buyer knows who to call. My buyer knows who to call and says, you just fixed this 2 weeks ago and it's already broke. I need you to come back and take care of it. So there's things we can do to protect the buyer. You and I can only do so much. The big protection for the buyer is going to be title insurance. Title insurance is only required if the buyer's getting a loan. If it's a cash buyer, it is highly recommended. It's the lender that requires it. So if it's a cash buyer, there is no lender, but we still need to look at that cash buyer and say, I think you should talk to the closing attorney about title. And oh no, I'm not worried about it. Nothing can happen. Smile sweetly and say you don't know that. So please, what's it hurt to have a conversation with the closing attorney? What does it hurt? Do you guys think that highly recommendation should be in writing, should be documented? Especially with a cash buyer?
Everything should be documented.
Everything should be documented. I do not want that cash buyer coming back after you and saying, well, I didn't know I needed title insurance. Have your documentation to protect yourself, you guys. So why do we have title insurance? Well, the attorney can only review recorded documents. So if it's not in public records, then the attorney can't review it. They can't. But there's other things we talked about, like the mechanics lien and maybe an encumbrance, like a encroachment or something. I don't know. Title insurance. If the buyer doesn't have the survey done, and then an encroachment is discovered after closing, I don't know how title insurance would feel about that. title insurance could very well say, had you had the survey done before closing, we would have found it and could have taken care of it, but you chose not to. So they may not have had that much protection. And that's another good conversation to have with your buyers about why they should have a survey done. Money now could save you from issues in the future. But remember, like we're saying, the attorney can only look at documents that are recorded, documents that are on public documents. Other things that could come up. What if it's decided later that the grantor was insane at the time? They had mental capacities at the time when they signed the deed over. What if somebody on a deed from way back has gone MIA and we can't find them? They're gone. They've fallen off the face of the earth and we cannot find them. So they're not there to sign the document. So we do not have that recorded document. Sometimes we have incorrect records. Sometimes mistakes just happen. And then sometimes, y'all brace yourselves. Sometimes people lie. Forgery is a very real thing. So found after the fact that somebody forged a document, somebody used a fake name, fake ID. You can't discover that in the public record search. And this is the kind of thing, this is why we have title insurance. It's not just the attorney's job to review the public records. It's anything that could show up on the title, recorded or not. Questions on title insurance? So as mentioned, the attorney does this deep dive in the public records, and they're looking at all of the deeds associated with this property, with this address, this property. And what they're looking for, it's like they're looking for a linking chain of conveyances, and what they're looking for is a kink in the chain. So what they're making sure is that the grantor on this deed matches the grantee on the previous deed. And the grantor on the previous deed matches the grantee on the previous deed. And that's how they get that link, that chain of conveyances, because those names link up. You can do the paper trail and see so-and-so bought it from so-and-so, bought it from so-and-so, bought it from so-and-so, and you can go back as far back as they need to. If there's ever a kink in the chain, then that's what's causing the attorney's red flag to go up. If there's a kink in the chain, it's legally referred to as a cloud on the title. So there's a cloud on the title, and the attorney will get with the current seller, will get with the homeowner to do whatever it is they have to do to clear it up. Maybe they just have to file a quit claim deed to fix it. Maybe they just have to, pay something. Maybe they have to go stand in front of a judge and ask the judge to take care of it. But the biggest thing that the attorney can do for their buyer client is to get with the seller and correct this, take care of this kink in the chain. And if it's something that could have been discovered, if it was something that could have been discovered before the seller bought it, then hopefully the seller still has title or has title insurance, because they may need it. So now their seller had a mechanics lien filed after the property. They don't send you a notice when they file a lien. So a lot of times these aren't discovered until you go to sell. You bought your house 10 years ago. They filed a mechanics lien for the repairs that you asked for. And then you go to close and like, oh, you got an outstanding mechanics lien. And you're going, what? That's why you have title insurance. Question comes in, it's for good as for as long as you own the property? Yes. Title insurance covers the buyer for the current owner, for as long as you own the property.
Is it like a one-time use? Like for some reason they find something and then later on they find something else?
Nope, it's for as long as you own the property. Yep, anything that happens to the title while you own it. And how many times do you have to pay title insurance? Just once. So that's the good news, right? It's not like, automobile insurance that shows up every 6 months or whatever. So that's good. Homeowners insurance once a year.
I haven't heard the word deductible, so we don't have that in this type of insurance.
No,
Okay.
it's just a one-time. Title insurance says we're going to charge X amount. The attorney puts it on the closing disclosure. And
Okay.
that's that. Somebody's asking about new construction. Yeah, because it's not about the structure. It's about the property. Structures come and go, but the property has been there. I know I had a pre-licensing student once and they were building and she was a cash buyer. And she said, well, my agent told me I didn't need title insurance because it's a new construction. Can you talk to me after class, please? Please, because I have a suggestion. Because it's not just about the structure that they're building. That land has been there for how long now, right? And that's what we're protecting is the property, the title. You have homeowners insurance for the structure. You have title insurance for the title. So again, the title search, title examination, the attorney is going to do a deep dive on the recorded documents. Usually they try to do an abstract if they can. If they see no issues, if they have no red flag goes up, they may do an abstract of title, which is kind of like the Cliff's Notes. It's a condensed history of the title. If they can go back 36 years and have no problems, then they'll declare that the title is marketable. They'll declare that it's good to go. And then once the attorney does their deep dive, that's when they offer their opinion of title to the title insurance company. And only then will the title insurance company release the policy based off of the attorney's opinion.
So no matter if they don't ever find any issues with the title, they will still offer the title insurance.
They have to,
Okay.
because fraud can't be discovered in the public records. Forgery, those things. So title insurance is only going to cover marketable title. Marketable title is what the attorney is proving. Marketable title is what the attorney is saying, this is what we have. So it's free from reasonable objectives. It's not going to place the buyer in a position of legal liability. It's not going to threaten the buyer's right to quiet enjoyment. All homeowners, even tenants, have the right to quiet enjoyment, which means you have the right to be in your property, use your property without noise or interference from interested third parties. So if somebody shows up laying claim, maybe they have a faulty document, maybe they have false reason to believe that the property is theirs. Title insurance is just meant to ensure that you have that right of quiet enjoyment. So if someone else comes, someone else may think that that property was passed down to them when a relative passed away. They may truly believe that the property is theirs, but title insurance is protecting the buyer from that type of scenario. Somebody shows up after the fact and says, this is mine. That's why we have title insurance and attorneys. As with any other insurance policies, there's a couple different policies. There's a standard policy and an extended policy. The standard policy usually covers problems identified after closing, things that we couldn't have identified, not known before closing. And then an extended is going to cover that as well, but also things like encroachments, unrecorded liens, adverse possession, things like that. Most title insurance companies will require the extended policy, or excuse me, most lenders will require the extended policy.
So the premium, they're probably different too, right? The standard is probably cheaper and extended is probably more expensive.
Yep. You're looking at, I've seen about $400 to $700, one-time fee, give or take. Don't write that down, but kind of give you an idea of what could range, what. So again, 2 policies if the buyer comes with a lender. If it's a cash buyer, title insurance is highly recommended, but if they come with a lender, we have 2 policies, lender's policy and the owner's policy. When you guys see owner, please make a note. That's referring to the current owner. Today they're the buyer, tomorrow they're the owner. So it kicks in when they become the owner. Could also see this referred to as mortgagee and mortgagor. Remember our mortgagor, borrower, the giver of the mortgage. The mortgagee is the lender. So lender policy, mortgagee policy. Like we said, the buyer gets to pay for both. The lender lets them pay for their policy as long as the borrower is buyers. And then it's that one-time fee. One and done. So how often is it paid? Just once. Just once. Does the lender's policy expire?
Yes.
Once the loan's been paid.
Yep. Yep. Once the loan's been paid, the lender's out. They would no longer have an interest in the property once you've paid them off. So the lender's policy is a diminishing policy. And when your balance hits 0, their policy's gone. The lender's out of here. What about the owner's policy? Is that going to expire?
No.
They stay covered for as long as they are the owner. Questions on title insurance? We have something called the Marketable Title Act. What the Marketable Title Act says is that if the attorney can do that linking the chains going back 30 years and they have no issues, then they can claim that the title is clear. And by claiming that the title is clear, they're extinguishing all old defects. So 30 years, no issues, nothing caused a red flag to go up. Everything looks good to go. The attorney could, under the Marketable Title Act, the attorney may claim the title is clear. Now, if we go back within 30 years and have an issue or find a kink in the chain, then they may choose to go back further just to make sure we have all that resolved for the new owner. So again, we talked about, sometimes so many people think it's not uncommon, you guys, that when a family member passes away, I'm getting their property. But if it's not in the will, you're probably not going to get it, but they think they are. So this could be an example of something that could come up. And this is why we have title insurance, because they're there for us. Questions? All right, so let's see real quick. Seller transfers a property by general warranty deed. Does the general warranty deed prove ownership?
Yes.
It doesn't guarantee or prove it. It just provides certain promises. One of those promises is that I am the legal owner. I am the one that can convey, but it doesn't prove it. It just allows me to say that I am. So it doesn't prove ownership, but it does just allow me to say, yes, I am. And if it's later discovered that I'm not, that's why you have title insurance. So I'm making you that promise, that guarantee, but there's no way to prove it using that deed. Let's see, a couple types of title insurance policies. What were the two we just saw?
Owner and lender policy.
Owner and lender. Yep.
Policy.
Yep. Owner and lender. Two different premiums, two different coverages, the extended and the standard policies. And it's paid one time. And then from last night with an auction property, foreclosure auction property. Anybody remember the name of the deed that is used to convey?
Sheriffs?
You're close.
Is it bargain and sale?
Not the bargain and sale, it's our trustee's deed. Remember that trustee is that impartial third party that's handling on the affair for the affairs of the lender in the event of the foreclosure. Shares deeds when the court's taken the property, but the trustee's deed is going to be the foreclosure. The trustee's deed is the one that has that power of sale. That's kind of a mean question, getting a little nitty gritty there. Sorry, yeah.
Special warranty deed?
Special warranty deed, possibly in a foreclosure. Yep, depending on situation, might even depend on somebody's mood that day. So yep, could also be in a foreclosure. And that gets us through Unit 10. Again, it's a lot of vocabulary words. It's being familiar with the terms, kind of the name of the game for that unit. So now that we've completed Unit 10, if you guys were waiting to complete this section, then you have a Part 2 exam. So we'll go in just a second. Well, you know what? Let's go right now while we're talking about it. Before we go to break, don't go to break just yet. We'll look in the online learning system. And under the Section 10 material is a Part 2 exam. So if you want to do all 3 parts this weekend, if you want to wait until next Thursday before class, whatever. But guys, please remember, I need all 3 of these exams done, we said, by next Friday morning, early Friday morning. Valentine's Day. Questions? All right, let's take a break. When we come back, Unit 11. Welcome back. Question comes in about the recording of the cram course, which leads me to my next, or my reminder of our cram course tomorrow. She was going to see if we could load it into Learn Test Pass for you guys, and I didn't hear back, so I think we're waiting to hear. So if we don't hear something, we'll figure it out. Because I know some of you guys want to be here, but you're not able to. So we're still working on it. But yeah, she does have the recording. It's just a matter of how she can best get it to you guys. So kind of stay tuned for that. And if anything, I can send you the link or throw it in our YouTube channel or something. But just stay tuned. We'll let you guys know. How many of you are planning on coming to the cram course on Saturday? Awesome. Awesome. Well, Jane will look forward to seeing you. Don't forget that email's coming from Lane tomorrow with Jane's Zoom link. And guys, remember too, we have not covered everything yet. So you may hear stuff for the first time on Saturday with Jane. Quite frankly, I don't care if you hear it with me first and then Jane, or if you hear it with Jane first and then me. The whole point is to hear it twice. So please don't be concerned if you hear something, because we still have more to cover next week as well. Questions on the cram course. Oh, the other thing I was going to say, if you don't have this email from Lane tomorrow, check your spam. But if you don't have it tomorrow by about the time you're eating dinner, please reach out to either one of us. Please do not wait until Saturday morning. I cannot guarantee that we'd be available at 10:25 to give you the link to help you get on. So if you don't have it by about the time you were sitting down for dinner tomorrow night, please reach out to one of us, but check your spam as well. Yep, you're good. And then we're also good. We just finished 10. So now we got the part 2 exam. Part 1 is after 5. Part 2 is after 10. And we're getting ready to work on the third part of this class, which is going to be units 11 through 15. So here we go. Guess what, you guys? We finally get to go to closing. We've been building up to it. We've created agency and we put them under contract and got loan approval and we got the appraisal and the attorney did his thing. And guess what? We finally get to go to closing, and that's where we're going to go in this unit. Most of this unit is some math. As I said last night, it's going to be a heavy math night tonight. But before we do that, we got a few things to talk about. So in this first section, we're going to talk about pre-closing procedures, what the broker needs to do, what the buyer needs to do, and what the seller needs to do to get ready for closing. We're going to mention just a little bit more about the buyer's due diligence process. We spent a good amount of time talking about that in Unit 8, but it's worth talking about now. Is the buyer's due diligence process is a very big part of the contract to closing process. We're going to talk about the difference in meeting methods. Some states are a settlement meeting method, and other states are an escrow meeting or an escrow settlement method. So we're going to talk about the different types of methods that different states use, and of course, specifically which one North Carolina does. So jumping right in. Yay, we're under contract. Now what? Well, now this is when we have buyer's agents. I'll be honest, buyer's agents, this is when your work starts. Up until this point, you've just been out looking at pretty properties, showing properties, looking at your buyer. They finally find the one and they write it up. And now this is when we really start. Listing agents, you do most of your work up front before you list it. But now that we're under contract, we need to make sure that we get our sellers ready for closing. It's a matter of getting everybody ready and everybody prepared. So one thing we'll want to do is kind of educate the parties about what comes next. I don't want to sit down and go through the whole process with them in one fell swoop and overwhelm them. So, I tend to like to break it up. Like, this is what you need to do this week. This is what you need to do that week. Under contract is when I have acceptance and communication of acceptance. So when it's signed, and then the fact that it has been signed has been communicated, congratulations, folks, we are under contract. So again, buyer's agents, we just want to make sure that we are walking the buyer through the due diligence. Y'all, they don't know what their due diligence process is. That's why they have us. So helping to educate the parties, particularly talking about the buyers, because they have the work to do during the contract process. And as I've said, seriously, the loan process is the longest, most complicated piece of the contract to closing process. So buyer's agents, you know, I'm all about celebrating the small wins. Buyer's agents, you get your buyer under contract, yay, but it's not over yet. You need to immediately get that signed contract to the lender so they can start on the loan process. Look at your buyers and tell your buyers that the lender is their priority. And they need to call the lender back before they call anybody else back, including their agent, including you. So whenever the lender asks for something, the buyer needs to get it to them. They're asking for it for a reason. The lender cannot go on to the next phase of the loan process until they've collected all the data. So they're collecting data from the borrower. They're working on getting the appraisal ordered. They're working on gathering all the data so they can send the completed file to underwriting. They can't send an incomplete file to underwriting and say, we'll send the rest of this to you next week. So make sure your buyers understand that failure to get the lender what they need in a timely manner could ultimately delay their own closing. So make sure they understand the importance of communicating with the lender, getting them what they need. When it comes out of underwriting, it's not uncommon to come out of underwriting the first time with the lender requesting more information. The buyer needs to make that a priority. They need to get the lender what they need when they need it. After we send that signed contract to the lender, the next thing we need to do is send that contract to the attorney. Again, we've all agreed on a settlement date. So let's go ahead and set and get that scheduled. Get in their books. And then we got to get that contract to the attorney so they can start doing that title search. Once the buyer has what they need to the lender, then we got to get the buyer going on their inspections. Their home inspection generally is first because that's kind of the overall, the big picture. The pest inspection would be another one that we can go ahead and get on the books, and then anything else they want to have inspected. Do they want to have the radon levels checked? Do they want to have the septic system inspected? Whatever they want to have inspected, this is their opportunity to learn as much about the property as they possibly can. So anything they want to research, anything they want to know about, this is what we need to get them working on. So we got inspections going. We got the attorney and the lender working for us. At some point, we want to encourage your buyer to have a survey done, especially if there's land. Now, if it's a condo or a townhome, we're not going to worry about it. But if there's any type of land, if there's any type of question about encumbrances or encroachments, anything about the land whatsoever, our answer is, I think you should get a survey done. So the surveyor will, again, we need to schedule them, come out. They generally offer like different levels, different services, but we want to go ahead and get them on the books in case something's discovered. That's something that we can take care of and address. Yeah, Evelyn, hey.
Your recommendation about this survey if the house is new construction, what do you think, that the buyer has to get another survey, or do you think it's okay with the seller?
I mean, the builder might provide it, but even if the seller provides the survey, the buyer's encouraged to have their own survey done. Now, if this new construction is in a subdivision, then we'll probably have a plat map. So we can provide that plat map to the borrower, to the buyer, excuse me, and if they're okay with that. Now, if they look at that plat map and said, I have a bunch of questions, then it might be that we want to recommend that they have a survey done. But if it's in a new development, a new subdivision, then that plat map will suffice. So yeah. The lender, once they reach the certain stage in their file, the lender's going to request the appraisal. Again, the appraisers are kind of in this big pool. And when the lender's ready for an appraiser, they hit a button and the next available appraiser goes out. It keeps it fair and it keeps it impartial. The buyer does not choose the appraiser. Think about it. How would you feel as the seller if you found out that the appraiser was the buyer's uncle? How's that make you feel? Right? So we want an impartial third party, somebody that doesn't know, somebody's not involved. So the lender will request it. The lender will request the appraiser. That's part of their process. The appraiser is not going to go out and do their thing until they've been paid. So the appraisal is a cost that the buyer's going to have to pay for before closing. So we want to get them paid so they can go out and do their appraisal. The other thing we want to get our buyers doing pretty early in due diligence is have them shopping around for homeowners insurance. And did you guys hear me? I want them shopping around. Don't just look at your buyer and say, this is the homeowners insurance company you're going to use and you're going to like that. Encourage them to shop around because homeowners insurance agents are not created the same. They're all different. They may offer different policies. So you'll form these relationships with these homeowners insurance homeowners insurance agents and encourage them to shop around so they can compare, contrast, and figure out which policy best works for their family. The lender, part of the loan approval, the lender has to approve the insurance policy that your buyer selects. So we want to make sure that we have the policy selected to the lender and approved all while we're in due diligence. Remember, part of your mortgage payment every month is 1/12 of that annual insurance policy. And if those premiums are high, if the borrower or the property have a history of claims, then the premiums may be high. And if your borrower was about maxed out anyway, and homeowners insurance, the premium is high, it may top them out. We may not get loan approval. So we want to have that policy secured and approved while we're still in due diligence. The buyer's homeowner's insurance policy will take effect when that new deed is recorded. When the buyer becomes the owner, that's when their policy kicks in. The buyer will also pay for the first year of homeowners. Homeowners insurance is paid for services in advance. So if I may pay my homeowners insurance today, I'm covered until February 5th, 2026. So part of the buyer's closing costs is going to be paid to pay for that first year of homeowners insurance. Next year, when it comes due, the lender has escrowed that as part of your payment. Next year, year one that you own the home, they will pay that insurance bill on your behalf out of the escrow. And then, of course, as we mentioned, the inspections. Pest inspections specifically look for wood-destroying insects, such as termites. Those little buggers can do some damage fast, by the way. And most of our residential properties in North Carolina, most of them are wood framed. So like the old joke is there's only 2 types of homes in North Carolina. Those that have had termites and those that will get termites. Isn't that funny? So, having them tested for termites, absolutely, that pest inspection, the buyer should consider that. If your buyer is getting a VA loan, the pest inspection is required. The VA will require the pest inspection. That's right, carpenter bees, powder post beetles, anything that dines on wood is what the wood destroying insect report is looking for. Now, it's not looking for all pests, but if your home inspector finds evidence of other pests, they will point that out. Like we said, the home inspector, their job is to go in the home and find problems. So they're gonna go in and they're gonna test stuff and look at stuff. They're gonna walk in rooms and hit light switches. If they hit a light switch and it doesn't do anything, then they may put in the report, light switch didn't do anything. Well, maybe a lamp needs to be plugged into the outlet. They're not saying it doesn't work. They're just saying when they walked in the room and flipped the switch, nothing happened. They can't fix it, but what they can do is recommend the buyer to talk to the electrician, the plumber, the general contractor, the structural engineer, whatever the concern is. But the home inspection is generally a good place to start. Help the buyer learning about the issues of the home. And then it's a matter of whether or not they want to deal with it or not. And I did always let my buyers know, all homes have problems. There's no such thing as a perfect house. So kind of preparing them for that. It's just a matter of what they're willing to tolerate. Yeah, D.
What about the grass? Because we found out like something is like there's a insect, some type of bugs that's in the grass that's not allowing the grass to grow. Like, and what if like somebody say, hey, we found this out?
If an inspector discovers it, then but the home inspector is just looking at the structure.
Okay.
So the pest inspector is looking at the structure. So if they find evidence of other pests, then they will point it out, but they're just looking at the structure. I have something to say about the home inspection for listing agents. Again, listing agents don't have much to do. Their job at this point is pretty much pack it up and get out, right? We got to get them out before settlement. But listing agents, because your sellers are packing and there's inevitably boxes and totes all over the place at this point, please let your sellers know that the home inspectors can't and won't touch personal property. So if there's boxes stacked up in front of the utility closet, the home inspector won't be able to get in to look at the fuse box, the water heater, that kind of thing. So listing agents, make sure your sellers have the components of the home accessible to the home inspector. Because they're not good. Because what if they pick that box up and drop it? Something's broken, now the seller's coming after it. So they're not going to touch personal property. If it's in their way, it will stay in their way. Does that make sense? So that's one of the best things that we can do, listing agents, is to kind of help this transaction go a little bit. Tell your sellers to keep those, the main components of the home available. Don't block doors and, crawl space doors, things like that. If there's an on-site septic system, the buyer may want to consider having the on-site septic system tested. Again, listing agents, prepare your sellers. The only way to inspect the septic tank, they're going to show up with the backhoe. They got to get down there to dig it. They got to get down there to get to it. Now, when they're done, they'll fill the dirt back in and pat it back up. But sellers have lost their minds before when somebody shows up with a backhoe on their property. So just prepare your sellers for this. It's part of the buyer's due diligence. It's part of their process. Of course, if there's not an on-site septic system and the backhoe shows up, now your seller can freak out a little bit. If it's public sewer, now your seller can freak out because they probably shouldn't be there. If this is vacant land or if we're new construction and we're getting ready to build, the buyer should be encouraged as part of their due diligence to have a PERC test, P-E-R-C, there it is, PERC test. The PERC test is going to determine where the septic system should go, where in relation to the home it should go. It's going to determine the capacity. It's going to determine the number of bedrooms. So we want to make sure that the soil is suitable for an on-site septic system. And if it's not, and they can't hook up to public, then your buyer probably can't build a house there. So that's something we definitely would want to make sure that we check out while we're still in due diligence. And how many human heartbeats per bedroom?
2.
2. Yep. So if it says it's 3 bedrooms, what that's saying is the septic system has the capacity for 6 people. And remember, it's all water leaving the house. It's not just bathroom water, it's shower water, dishwater water, washing machine water, all water that's leaving the house. And that's why they say per bedroom. Buyer's agents, we may be probably getting in the home a few times now that we're under contract. We want to try to meet the home inspector at the end of their inspection so we can have that conversation with them and the buyers about the things of concern to the home inspector. You know, maybe your buyer wants to check out paint samples, or they want to take the tape measure and figure out where their couch is going to go. We want to try to get them in a few times, again, being very reasonable and considerate if the home is still occupied, if the seller's still living there. You know, try to limit your visits, but we do want to try to get them in a few times. And we are still looking for things. Every time we go in the property, the buyers are looking for things, we're looking for things, the home inspector's looking for things. And the more sets of eyes you have on it, the better chance you have to catch things. And another thing that we're looking for is any signs of recent construction, any kind of renovations. You know, if this was finished with matching vinyl siding, it would be close. But if you look real close, you could tell that this was not the original. You could tell that this was new, assuming it was finished. So that means just my little red flag goes up to ask some questions. The home inspector might be looking for this kind of thing as well. We also want to make sure, you know, ask questions about permits. If we do find, you know, maybe they finished the unfinished basement, or they added this room to the back of the house, ask about permits, were permits obtained. We're communicating sometimes with the listing agent throughout the process, as well as your buyer is trying to learn. So it's okay to reach out to the listing agent, ask questions. Maybe they know, maybe they don't. Maybe the seller knows, maybe the seller doesn't. But we're just asking questions, trying to get that information. We also want to help our buyers review zoning, our public land use controls. And then if we're in an HOA, then we want to help them look at those covenants, those private land use controls, make sure that their end use can be met. Now, hopefully, if they told you before you started looking or showing them property that they want to be able to convert their garage into a hair salon, hopefully we're checking zoning before we ever see the property, right? Because if zoning doesn't allow for it, then why show the property? Hopefully we're checking with the HOA before we show the property. But now that we're under contract, we just kind of want to help verify these things, review these things. We can help our buyers get their hands on the covenants so they can review those. I can provide my buyers the covenants. They're on public records. You can find them. Sometimes the listing agent seller will provide them to us. But I can help my buyers get their hands on the covenants. I cannot interpret the covenants for them. I cannot interpret these legal documents. So when your buyer starts having a bunch of questions about what does this mean, and you're telling me I can't park my RV in my driveway, then we'll either need to get them to the HOA or get them to an attorney to get those questions answered. I cannot interpret them. I just provide it for them. Another thing the buyer may want to consider addressing is any environmental matters. We talked about these in Unit 3. So if they want to have anything tested or inspected about environmental issues, due diligence is the time to do it. Many of our home inspectors are a great place to start. Many of our home inspectors, if they can't do the testing or offer the testing, then they can help point us in the right direction. So again, another good reason to get some home inspectors in your vendor list so you can reach out, rely on, they can at least point you in the right direction. So some environmental matters that we talked about in Unit 3, lead or lead-based paint, anything built prior to what year?
Yeah.
1978.
1978.
Y'all are like over here screaming at me. I love it. Does your family ever wonder what we're doing in here, really? So anything built prior to 1978, if you're a buyer, we want to get them that EPA's education pamphlet to help educate them on the possible dangers of lead in the home. But they may want to have that tested. So again, the home inspector can often help with that, or at least point us in the right direction. If there's any concern about asbestos, that's often that insulation found around piping. Asbestos was banned in 78 as well. You don't need to know that year for our exam, but that kind of gives us an idea of, something that was built in 2000. I sure hope you don't find asbestos. But anything built prior to 78, again, if you have a little red flag that goes up, just have that tested. We do want to encourage our buyers to have a radon test. Radon tests, usually the home inspectors can perform these. They'll leave them in the home for about 2 or 3 days, depending. And the radon test in the home, it takes like a snapshot of the radon level every hour. So what's the radon level this hour and that hour? And then at the end of that 2 or 3 days, it gives us an average. Does anybody remember the number for radon? Look at you guys. Y'all were just waiting on me.
4.3.
Yep. Anything more than 4.0 picocuries is bad. So that's when we can ask that. We can always ask the seller to put in a radon mitigation system. Does the seller have to agree to do that? No, but we can ask. That could be part of our due diligence repair and request. Mold. Remember, you guys, when you and I are walking through the home, we're looking for stuff. We're smelling for stuff. We're seeing if we can't find signs of mold, moisture. If there's ever been a previous leak or flood, there's a really good chance that mold might have at one point been there. So again, just looking for these signs. If we do come across mold, we may want to have it tested, have your buyer have it tested to determine what type of mold it is. There's like thousands of strands of mold out there. I mean, it's unbelievable how much mold is out there. So not all mold is bad mold, but some mold is bad mold. And that's what we want to look for, is bad mold and how it can be tested. Yeah, that might be an accidental unmute.
Bro, let's get straight to it. Oh my.
Okay. Meth. If it was the site of a former meth home, that may be something that's a concern to your buyer. Remember, I guess there's tests you could buy. The home inspector could point us in the right direction. But remember, listing agents, if we ever learn, it doesn't matter how you learn, but if we ever learn that the home was once previously used as a meth lab, then that will always be a material fact on the property. And then just some other things that we talked about back in Unit 3, those biphenyls, those polychlorine biphenyls, just a chemical process that was used for building, construction, that kind of thing. Any pressure treated wood, a lot of furniture might have pressure treated wood, and that pressure treated wood might have formaldehyde. Formaldehyde, again, if it's concentrated, if it doesn't have not well ventilated, then it could be a respiratory issue. A lot of our furniture has that pressure wood with that formaldehyde. That was something that was banned many years ago, but then the ban was lifted and it was reduced to a warning. So any of my High Point people, after hearing this, I'm like very worried about the furniture market, because I just feel like there's a lot of formaldehyde in town during during that time with all that furniture. But and a lot of times if you go buy furniture, I had somebody say once they bought bunk beds for their kids, and there was a tag on it talking about warning may contain formaldehyde. So it's about proper ventilation, keeping the air flowing in the home. That's why we have good HVAC systems and everything. Keep it going. And then another thing that we talked about was our underground storage tanks. So if we have any sign, maybe there's a pipe sticking out of the ground, maybe there's a stain on the soil, for example, that could be a good indicator that there's a leaking underground storage tank. They're not all leaking, but we're just looking for those signs. So you and I, with our buyers, I mean, we're not just looking in the property, we're outside, we're in the backyard, we're in the side yard, front yard, just helping them see things that they don't know that they're looking for. And remember what we said last night, you guys, nothing is off limits. So whatever it is your buyer wants tested or inspected or investigated, our answer is always, absolutely, let's do it, because they are trying to learn as much as they possibly can. Please don't ever look at a buyer and say, nah, you don't have to worry about that. I've had a couple agents over the years, not many, but I've had a couple agents over the years say that as part of the buyer's due diligence, they want the priest to come over, check the vibes of the home. I'm like, that's not a bad idea. I'm not opposed to this, you know? So if your buyer wants to bring the priest over, or mom and dad or whatever, then we just set aside time, coordinate time that we can get that checked out. Questions, comments about, I mean, there's a lot going on during due diligence, right? Can we see that due diligence, those costs are adding up? But also remember, closing constitutes acceptance of the property and its then current condition. So if the buyer is going to accept the property, they have to know what they're accepting. And the only way to know what they're accepting is to have these tests and inspections and investigations. Not many, very few are required by the lender. So it's all at the discretion of the buyer. And it's up to me and you to explain these different things to them and why we should encourage them to do it. But ultimately, they're the ones that decide. Questions? So your buyer has inspected and investigated, and they've learned everything that they can to know about the property. And there's a really good chance, depending on the market, depending on the situation, depending on the scenario, but most buyers want to ask the seller for repairs. Buyers agents, this is really where we need to educate our buyers. And we need to let our buyers know up front that the seller is under no obligation to do repairs. Please don't lead your buyer in any way to think that the seller is going to fix it all. Please don't lead your buyer to think in any way that the seller has to fix anything. Is everybody good with that? So we got to prepare our buyers. So when we're presenting the repair request, the buyer is making an offer to the seller. And the seller, as the offeree, what are their three options with the repair request?
Accept, reject, or negotiate.
They can accept, they can agree to do all the repairs. They can reject and say, nope, I'm not doing anything. Or we can negotiate, we could counter. Maybe I'll do this, but not that. So we really are entering into round 2 of negotiations. If the seller accepts to do it all, or if they agree to do some of it, please understand our response is thank you very much, understanding that they don't have to change a light bulb if they don't want to. We've got to prepare our buyers for that. What do y'all think? Do you think buyers like this? That sellers don't have to fix anything?
No.
Not at all. You've got to prepare your buyers for this. I would even throw caveat emptor at them, throw fancy words at them so you know what you sound like you're talking about, right? But we've got to prepare them for this. We've got to prepare them for the possibility for the seller to come back and say, I'm not fixing anything. And this is what due diligence is about. Now that your buyer knows everything that there is to know, including the fact that the seller is not willing to do a repair, the buyer now has a decision to make. Do I terminate or do I proceed to closing? Repairs. Any repair negotiations need to be agreed on, signed, and in writing and signed, while we're still in due diligence. We have to have the seller's signature agreeing to do these repairs while we're still in due diligence. The repairs themselves don't have to be complete until prior to settlement. we can go on from due diligence. We can pass due diligence without the repairs being done because we have a signed document from the seller saying that they agree to do it. And once we have that, the seller is now contractually obligated to do so. So the repairs themselves don't need to be done until prior to settlement. Questions on that? Property may be occupied by tenants. If we have a valid lease, the buyer buys, honoring that existing lease. Hopefully we knew this before we went under contract. Tenants aren't really happy about you showing their home. I'll just say that. There you go. So just know that. But if there's a valid lease in place, then the tenant will remain, the buyer will buy, honoring that valid lease. Sometimes you even see an MLS and like the agent only remarks just between us, you know, tenant in place, but they're moving out the end of the month, or tenant in place, valid lease until the end of the year, right? So hopefully they'll share a little bit of information with us before the showing. But, you know, if it comes up, if we have questions, if your little red flag goes up, never hesitate to question. And remember, we saw our additional provisions addendum last night that addressed how we're going to get, you know, copies of the lease and is the tenant up to date on rent, that kind of thing. And along with making sure we transfer that security deposit from the seller landlord to the new buyer landlord when that deed changes hands. We got our tenant landlord property management unit 13 is coming up next week. So we're going to take a break from the sales side of it and go into the lease side of it in unit 13. Kind of switch gears just a hair. We talked about the attorney's big responsibility of that title search. The whole point of doing that title search is making sure that their buyer client gets clear marketable title. That is the seller's responsibility, is to pass that clear marketable title. And you can look at the seller and say, can you do that? Oh yeah, I can pass clear marketable title. But don't we want a legal eye on it? Don't we want that closing attorney? And that's why the buyer hires the attorney. That's their number one responsibility, is to make sure that their buyer client is getting that clear marketable title. And if they find any defects or cloud on the title, then the attorney will get with the seller and do whatever we have to do to get this cleared up. Is it pay something off? Is it go stand in front of the judge and request an action to quiet the title? Whatever the defect is, whatever the issue is, the attorney will get with the seller to clear up. And by the way, this goes on past due diligence. So even if due diligence is over and there's an issue with the title, the seller still has to get it corrected, or else the seller will be in breach. Due diligence has nothing to do with the seller's duties and obligations. So closer and closer to closing. The lender's been doing their thing. The closing attorney's been doing their thing. So as we get closer and closer, at some point, the lender and the closing attorney are going to have to come together. They're going to have to make sure that all their stuff lines up. And as we get closer to settlement, once we get loan approval, the lender calls that the clear to close. That's my second favorite email in this whole industry. Simple, sweet, to the point. Clear to close. My first favorite email, we are on record. So to get we are on record, I first have to get a clear to close. So attorney and lender are putting finishing touches on everything. And one thing that the lender's going to do, they will send their loan package to the attorney with instructions on how they want their loan package handled. So the attorney will get with the buyer at settlement. Y'all bought a house in the last 12, 15 years. Was it intimidating when the closing attorney sat down with a stack of paper like this thick? I mean, they pretty much plopped a ream of paper in front of you and said, all right, here we go. This is what we have to sign. Guys, most of that is the loan package. The loan package comes from the lender with instructions, and the attorney goes through that loan package with the buyer per the lender's instructions. Once we all leave settlement and the attorney proceeds with closing, they're going to send that signed loan package back to the lender for final approval. And the lender's going to make sure everything is signed and dated and initialed and everything is completed the way that they wanted it. And then and only then, once they're satisfied that that loan package is complete, that's when they release the loan funds. So when we're at settlement, we still don't have the loan funds. It's not until the lender puts their final eye on it once the buyer has signed it. It's a whole bunch of things in that loan package. There's the mortgage note, the promissory note, the mortgage note. There's a deed of trust in North Carolina, mortgage in other states. And then closing disclosure, we talked about some TRID and RESPA requirements. There's some documents required through them. And a lot of times too, like if your buyer and lender have been communicating and your buyer has been e-signing everything, closing in North Carolina is still a wet signature. So a lot of times the lender will say, look, they've e-signed it, but since they're sitting in front of you, why don't you just have them put a wet signature on it? So your buyer may be signing things that they've already signed, but it's all at the discretion of the lender. What do you think? Are we going to be at settlement with our buyers while they're signing this packet?
Yes.
Yeah. We're still old Karin, aren't we? We're going to see this thing through the very end for our buyers. So we're going to be there. That way, if they have any questions, I'm not saying you have to take the file, but at least have your laptop or your tablet handy. So if any questions come up, you can pull up the sales contract or the document, whatever the question was. The other thing I'll say about that, those of you that have bought a home before, I don't know. For me, it was a very nerve-wracking experience. I'm getting ready to take on a 30-year commitment. It sounds very like mature and responsible, right? It's a big deal to buy a house, right? I was nervous. The first condo I bought, I was nervous. And I was very comforted when I saw my agent in the parking lot at the closing attorney. I got out the car and my knees were like jello. I was like, I can't do this. She was like, yoo-hoo, are you ready? And it was very comforting for me to see this person that has been with me throughout the whole transaction. Does that make sense? So if nothing else, be the face, be the person that you've been with your buyer this whole time. By the way, the commission may consider that negligence on our part if we don't go to closing, because we're going to see this through to the very end. So the lender provides the buyer's closing disclosure. We're going to get ready to talk about this closing disclosure. This is where we're heading. Closing disclosure is going to disclose certain costs for the borrower. So there's two closing disclosures, actually, one for the buyer and one for the seller. The lender provides the buyer's closing disclosure. The lender has nothing to do with the seller. The lender is strictly working with the buyer, the borrower. So they're going to prepare the buyer's closing disclosure. It's going to show the buyer's debits and credits. It's going to break down all of their closing costs. We're not just going to look at the buyer and say, this is how much you have to bring to closing. We're going to be able to break it down for them. The closing disclosure is going to show them to the penny how much they're paying for this and that, all their debits, all their credits. Seller's closing disclosure comes from the attorney. So the closing attorney prepares the seller's closing disclosure. The lender prepares the buyer's closing disclosure, and sends it to the attorney for the attorney to put any finishing touches on it, anything else that they may need. And then the attorney sends the closing disclosures to me and you. And it's my responsibility to verify these things for accuracy. I'm not preparing them, but I do have a duty to make sure that they are accurate. And we're going to talk about how I can verify what I can verify. I cannot verify everything on it, but I do have a duty to verify what I can. So when we get these things on behalf of our clients, we need to sit down and review it. We need to make sure that the numbers look right. We need to make sure that they tally up. I'm not going to lie to you guys. It's not a matter of if you find a mistake. It's when you find a mistake. Humans prepare these things. Humans make mistakes. Y'all ever make a mistake? It happens, right? Humans prepare them. And the thinking is, the more sets of eyes we can put on these things, the better chance for accuracy we have. Your buyers and sellers don't know how to calculate these things. They don't know what all this stuff is. This is why they have us. Who can remind me about the A in an old car? What's the A in old car?
Accounting.
Accounting. We're
Accounting.
accounting for their funds. And doesn't that include accounting for their final funds? Making sure that what your seller's going to get is accurate, making sure what your buyer has to pay is accurate. So this is very much an old car duty, an old car responsibility. So this is where we're heading. We're going to get in. We're not doing a full-blown closing disclosure. There's the good news. You don't have to do a full-blown closing disclosure until you come see me in post-licensing. Doesn't that sound like fun? And we will. We will do an actual closing disclosure. All we're going to do in pre-licensing, we're easing you in. And all we're going to do in pre-licensing is what I refer to as a mini closing disclosure. And there's a really good chance you're going to have a test question about this long. And the question is going to be, how much does your buyer have to bring to closing? So we're going to talk about your buyer's debits and credits, and we're going to figure out what their bottom number is to the penny. Because guys, in the real world, once I review it from the attorney, the lender doesn't tell the buyer how much to bring to closing. The attorney doesn't tell the buyer how much to bring to closing. I tell the buyer how much to bring to closing. Once I've reviewed it, once I've checked it for accuracy. Your buyer will have to bring readily available funds. I need a cashier's check or a wire transfer. It may be up to the discretion of the lender. Not the lender, I'm sorry, the attorney. But no attorney is going to let your buyer bring a personal check, because we don't want to delay closing waiting on that check to clear the bank. So readily available funds, and again, it's going to be up to the discretion of the attorney. Some attorneys say any amount over $25,000 wire transfer, for example. Questions so far? All right, let's take 10. right. Welcome back. So I'm taking attendance. Okay, difference between settlement and closing, we talked about when we looked at our offer to purchase and contract. So settlement is when buyers and sellers, thank you, with their attorneys, or not their attorneys, their brokers, buyers and sellers with their brokers go to the attorney's office generally, and they sign, the seller or the buyer's going to sign their loan package, their closing paperwork. The seller has a couple forms to sign, not near as many as the buyer. And then the buyer's going to bring their funds. And if the seller owes anything, they're going to bring their funds. So settlement is about the buyer and seller settling things between them, finalizing things between them. Once we all leave settlement is when the closing proceed or the attorney proceeds with closing. And closing is the legal process that finalizes everything. With the very last act, the very last thing to happen is the buyer's brand new deed gets recorded in the public records. And then, and only then, is it a done deal. It's not the buyer's until that deed gets recorded. So as we talked about last night or the other night, guys, we can't give the buyers their keys until it's recorded. We can't give them access to the property. Buyers want them. They want to leave the attorney's office and go right over their brand new home. But we need to make sure, and don't let them look at you and say, trust me, I won't go over. We need to make sure, in this case, we're still protecting the seller's best interest. You're protecting yours as well. So we just need to make sure that we're not giving the buyer access to the property until we get that email from the attorney that says we are on record. Most attorneys, everybody's working really hard for settlement and closing to happen on the same day. Most attorneys won't schedule settlement after like 3:30 in the afternoon to give them time to finish settlement. Because y'all, with the register of deeds, they close at 5 on the dot. They're not going to wait till 5:01, right? So at 5 o'clock, they're done. The good news is it's 2025, so we all e-record these days, which means the attorney just has to submit it and then get confirmation back from the register of deeds that it's been received. Nobody gets paid until that deed is recorded. You and I are not getting commission checks. Do not go to settlement and ask the attorney where your check is. Nobody gets paid. We don't get our commission check. The lender doesn't get their fees. The attorney doesn't get paid. The seller doesn't get paid until it's a done deal, until that new deed is on record. If you've never used this attorney before, you can ask them, about how long, so you have an idea. You don't want to go too far, because some of them may record, batches throughout the day. Some may do like a batch before lunch and then a batch before we go home, right? They're all a little bit different on how they handle it. So it's okay to ask about how long, but most firms, they'll either allow you to go pick up the check and deliver it to the firm. Maybe they'll mail it. Your firm very well may have a policy on when or how they get that check. Just remember, if you're snail mailing it, you got to wait. Some days, sometimes longer than others. So most agents I know want to go pick their check up and get it to their office, so their office can process that and get them paid. Questions on settlement, closing, kind of that process? So there's a couple different closing methods. Some states do things a little bit differently. Non-North Carolina states, doesn't matter which states, but non-North Carolina states may do an escrow method closing. With an escrow method closing, they're not handled by a closing attorney. They're handled by an escrow agent, which is usually the title insurance company. Buyer and seller don't meet. They just provide the escrow agent their documents. They process it, stamp it, record it. It's a done deal. North Carolina is one of few states that is a settlement meeting method state, which means ours are handled by an attorney, a closing attorney. So North Carolina is a settlement meeting method state. Now I want you guys to write something down for me just to help us understand the verbiage. I often refer to them as a closing attorney, and they are, but they can also be referred to as the settlement agent. The settlement agent is the closing attorney in a settlement meeting method state. North Carolina is one of few states that still does settlement meeting method. And I think it's important for us to know this, especially when you have a buyer moving here from another state. They have experience buying properties in another state. And you're going to start talking about the settlement agent. And at one point, they're going to go, wait a minute. I have to hire an attorney? And the answer is yes. If you're buying a property that's located in the state of North Carolina, yes, because we are an attorney closed state. Buyers almost always need to attend settlement. There may be exceptions where the lender and the attorney allow the buyer to do a mail away closing where they sign their paperwork in front of a notary and then overnight it to the closing attorney. But that's an exception, and the buyer's going to have a pretty good excuse. They're not going to allow that to happen on the norm. So most of the time, buyers will be at settlement. Buyer's agents, you need to be with it with your buyers. Sellers may or may not attend settlement. It's been my experience, sellers go one of two ways. Either they're over it, they want to sign their paperwork in front of a notary, send them with their agent at the closing attorney's office, and just call me when it's done. Other sellers want to go to the attorney's office and see this thing through to the very end. So listing agent, we just need to give our sellers options. Do you want to sign at the closing attorney's office, or do you want to sign ahead of time in front of a notary? Totally at the discretion of the seller, possibly the attorney. Listing agents, if your seller is going to settlement, then you need to go with them. If they're not going to settlement, then you need to be available in case they need something, in case something comes up. So don't go MIA on settlement date. You need to be around. You need to be handy. Most attorneys will perform settlement. Some may have their paralegals do it. The paralegal at this point is just pretty much coming in and saying, sign here, date here. They're not preparing anything. They're not drafting the documents. The attorney's done all that. But it's been in my experience, I don't think I've ever had settlement with a paralegal. It's been my experience with the closing attorney. And that way, if any legality questions come up, we have the attorney there that can answer questions. If your buyer's using a local lender, the lender may come to settlement as well. Again, just for support, just there to answer questions. Settlement is often at the closing attorney's office, but there's no rule that says that it has to be. Settlement can be wherever. So I've done settlement before in the conference room with a real estate firm. There used to be an attorney in Greensboro that worked out of her home. Even before COVID, she worked out of her home. So settlement happened at her dining room table. So the location doesn't matter. Questions? So once the documents are recorded, again, that's when they've hit the public records at the Register of Deeds. Money has changed hands, documents are recorded. That's when your buyer can get their keys. We also have something called the North Carolina Good Funds Settlement Act. That's the act that says money and keys cannot change hands prior to settlement. The contract says the keys can't change hands prior to closing. And again, just tell your buyers up front as we're getting closer and closer to settlement, just make sure that they understand well before we go. You're not going to get your keys when we're at the attorney's office. We'll get your keys once that deed is recorded. My husband and I bought this house a little over 4 years ago, and I got to be our agent. I did get to wear 2 hats, and it was really interesting for me to go through it as a buyer to see it from that end. And we went to the closing attorney, and I remember I walked up to the desk and I said, you know, the Campbells are here. And she got this really sad look on her face, and she said, did your agent not come? I said, it's me. I am one of the. She's like, oh, that's right. I'm so sorry. But she was like, it was that unheard of that a buyer would be there, you know, without an agent. I was like, no, I'm one and the same. So we left. As the buyer's agent, they handed me the key. My husband said, can we go to our house yet? I went, nope. As your agent, not until I get that email that says we are on record. He's like, are you kidding me? And I'm like, no, I'm not kidding. As your agent, because y'all know me, what does the contract say? So we went to lunch. We went to Home Depot, because that's what you do when you buy a house, apparently, is you go to Home Depot a lot. So we were at Home Depot when I got the email, and I'm like, now we can go. But even playing that role, you know, just making sure, just because it's me and him didn't mean that that was any different. By the way, the best part of that, oh yeah, I got paid a commission. Nice. So absolutely, I had no problem representing myself. No problem whatsoever. Any questions on the key, money, change in hand things? It was.
Julie, I just wanted to say that I just recently bought a house, you know, down here at the beach, and we did our final walkthrough the day Hurricane Debbie came through, and we had to drive to Wilmington, and on our way to Wilmington in this hurricane, 17 was flooded, so they turned us around. So we could not close on that Monday, so we were going to start traveling up the road on Tuesday. So we did close on Tuesday. However, when we were given the keys, we had appliances delivered the day we closed because it was supposed to be the day earlier. And we had started moving in when I get a phone call from the agent that says, the Register of Deeds is closed because they're flooding and underwater. It was 4 days. So 4 days. And then she's like, I can't make you move out. So we had the renter's insurance.
You did that buyer possession before closing? Yep.
Yes, but it was a nightmare.
Yeah, I bet. And a perfect, thank you, Michelle, and a perfect example of things just happen that are out of our control sometimes. So, you know, there's, we call them creative solutions, right? There's other things we can do. So buyer and seller could agree to do, in that case, a buyer possession before closing, where the sellers let Michelle move in before she had the property. But like she said too, the key is making sure that they were properly insured, because we wanted to have all those new appliances covered, right, through her renter's insurance until she became the homeowner.
Yeah, I felt like a squatter till they recorded. So it was nerve-wracking.
You didn't really feel at home until it became your home, right? I mean, that makes total sense. You know? Yeah, and I mean, things happen, and we just, you know, we figure it out. We just figure it out. And the one thing I like about things happening at settlement is we got an attorney sitting right there, so we can, get something drafted up real quick if we need to. So that's reassuring.
So what if you get your keys at the table at the attorney's office? That mean they recorded it there, or
That means they gave you your keys before you closed. Usually they will give the key to the buyer's agent, and then the buyer's agent, I keep that key secure in my pocket until I get the email. But on occasion, you buyers will be given the keys before. But again, what does the contract say? And the contract says that keys possession should not be given to the buyer until closing.
okay, because maybe because I wasn't there. It was my husband, but I guess maybe because he was from out of town and he was leaving back on a flight. So maybe that's why they did it that way.
I don't know, but again, what does the contract say? Not all attorneys follow the contract, not all brokers follow the contract. Julie does, so because I'm protecting my clients, I'm protecting my buyers and sellers. I'm sure we all have stories about access before, but could that be seen as violation of your agency duties if you give somebody access to somebody else's home before it becomes theirs, right? We see where we're going with this, right? And like I said, what if your buyer, it's not theirs yet, and they go running over there and they walk through the front door and they fall down and hurt themselves? The liability is still on the seller at this point. It's still their home. So, I mean, I know I'll be careful, nothing will happen, but we also know how life goes sometimes, I tend to hurt myself more when I'm trying to be careful. So that's when it's gonna, that's me. All right. Speaking of insurance, like we said, the buyers got their insurance policy. They secured that during due diligence. It's gonna take effect. It's gonna kick in when they become the owner. So this is another reason why they're not getting keys, because it's not their home yet until the deed records. Listing agents, you need to have the conversation with your sellers and make sure that they understand not to cancel their insurance until that deed changes hands. Especially, this is what sellers go, especially if they're moving out well before settlement. So the home's going to be vacant for a couple weeks or something. And some sellers think, well, I'm not living there anymore, so I can save some money and cancel insurance. Truth is, vacant homes are much more susceptible to vandalism. They're much more susceptible to damage because there's nobody there to watch it. There's nobody there to guard it. So if your seller's moving out well before settlement, have the conversation that they need to keep that insurance until that deed records. They also, if they're going to be like a couple weeks or months before settlement, we need to encourage our seller to report the home as vacant to their insurance company. Now, their premiums will probably go up for that period of time, but if something happens, if the insurance company doesn't know that it's vacant and something happens, they may not cover the seller. They may say, you didn't tell us that you moved out, so we're not going to cover you. Again, document that conversation. I can't make the seller call the insurance agent, but the best thing I can do is have that conversation so they understand that risk of loss. The home is not doubly insured on closing settlement day. The seller's policy ends when the deed records. The buyer policies begin when the deed records. So if something happens to the property on settlement closing day, both insurance companies are going to want to know when the deed recorded and when the incident happened, because that'll tell us who owned it and who was responsible for it. So if the house burns down, the fire marshal will have to give us an idea what time it burned down, what time the deed recorded. Because again, we know insurance companies, right? Neither one wants to step up and pay. So they're going to want some kind of evidence of who owned it when the incident happened. Part of the seller's loan payoff, part of it, not their payoff, but their loan. They got to pay off their mortgage. Remember our lien priorities, all those people standing in line. So the seller's mortgage is paid off before they are paid. The seller's the very last person in that line. And then once the lender will, or the attorney will assist in paying that off for the seller on behalf of the seller. But once the seller's lender receives their mortgage payoff, then they're eventually going to file a mortgage cancellation or a satisfaction of seller's mortgage. It takes a little time for that to process, but they will eventually have that deed of release that shows that that has been taken care of. Yeah, Stephanie.
So is that why when you buy a house, like you have 2 to 3 months before your payments due?
So you get your first month off, and we're gonna talk about that in just a bit, actually. So you get a month off when you buy a house, and that has to do with your debt service. Also, when you sell your house, the sale of the home has to be reported for taxation purposes. There's a form. The IRS has a form for when you sell your home. It's 1099-S. Are you going to have to pay taxes on the gain of your house, on the sale of your house? I don't know. We need to tell your seller to talk to their accountant. They got to report it. It will be reported to the IRS. Are they going to have to pay? Are they going to get money? I don't know. They have to talk to their accountant. The attorney generally will file the 1099-S on behalf of the seller, just so they don't forget after settlement. So the attorney generally takes care of that. That's part of the seller's paperwork, the seller's documentation. Yeah, Dan.
If you lived in a house 2 years out in residence, you get $150,000 capital gain tax.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up on me.
I want in North Carolina.
Not
Test 1 2 3.
a little better.
Okay. In North Carolina, if you are single and you purchased a house and you lived in it for 2 years, your capital gain tax is up to $250,000. And if you are
Correct.
married, your capital taxes gain is up to $500,000, and you're able to do it every 2 years and not get taxed on any amount over. So,
Thank you. We're going to put on our accountant hat. Are you in Unit 12? We're going to talk a little accountant hat. But again, you guys, unless you're a CPA, unless you're an accountant, we can't be giving that advice. We have to advise our buyers and sellers to talk to their accountant. And just because you may do your taxes once a year on TurboTax does not make you an expert. Stay in your lanes. Questions? You guys have your books with you? You guys have your books handy? Let's look in our books. Turn with me, if you will, to page 163. 163. So in 163, we have a sample loan estimate. Remember the loan estimate, you guys can show me. How many days after loan application does the loan estimate come out? Yep. 3 days. 3 days after loan application. RESPA requires the lender to send, or TRID requires the lender to send the loan estimate within 3 days of loan application. And keep in mind, this is an estimate. We're only 3 days after loan application. This is not the final end all be all, but this has given us an idea. So you can see on 163, we have the borrower's information, the property, the sales price. There's the term of the loan. It's a 30-year conventional loan. The rate lock's been locked in at this time and date. And then there's our loan amount of 162, our interest rate, our estimated monthly principal and interest, our estimated debt service. Can these amount increase after closing? Then is there a prepayment penalty? Yes or no? Is there a balloon payment? Yes or no? These things are designed for the borrower to be able to look at these and see real clearly. Ooh, I have a prepayment penalty. What does that mean? No, I don't have a balloon payment. They're pretty easy to look at. And if the borrower has questions about these, we're only 3 days after loan application, so they have plenty of time to get with the lender to get their questions answered. After that, we have their projected payments. We might still be guesstimating our debt service or our insurance or our estimated escrow for taxes and insurance. So we have our guesstimated payment calculation. And then at the very bottom of 163, we have our estimated closing costs. And then right under that is the estimated cash to close. So within 3 days of loan application, your borrower knows, your buyer knows that they're going to have to bring about $16,054 with them to closing. Now, TRID has some regulations, because remember, this is an estimate. So there could be some changes. But TRID has some regulations about what can change and by how much. So the lender's got to be pretty accurate. I will say this, there is no problem when the estimate is higher than the actual. So when we estimate it's going to be this amount, but in the end, you only have to bring this amount, that's not the problem. The problem that TRID has is when the estimate or the actual is more than the estimate. So with a lot of the closing costs and stuff like that, I do think lenders tend to overestimate those, give themselves some wiggle room. Because again, put yourself in the buyer's shoes. You're told $16,054. In just a minute, when we go to closing, it's going to be less than that. And that's good news to the buyer, right? That's not a problem. The problem is if the end happens to be more than that $16,054. So hang on to that number. We'll see that. Turn to page 164. It's not that we just tell you that you have to bring $16,054. Page 154 breaks it down into specifics. This is where we came up with that $16,054. So there's your loan costs. There's your appraisal fee, for example, your pest inspection, your title insurance. You have your recording fees, prepaids, etc. So it gives you a breakdown of how we came to that estimated cash to close. Over, let's see, 165, just more loan information for the borrower. And then turn with me to page 166. And we have our closing disclosure. So now fast forward to settlement. How many days prior to settlement does the lender have to send the borrower their CD? Once again, it's 3. If we can remember 3, we're good to go, right? 3 days after loan application, you get the loan estimate. 3 days prior to settlement, you get the CD. So now that we're prior to settlement, again, you got your borrower's information, closing date, etc. There's the loan terms. And then we see the same information. We could literally compare 166 to 163. The loan amount hasn't changed. My interest rate hadn't changed. My payment hadn't changed. It looks like my estimated total monthly payment did go up by 26 cents a month, but I don't think anybody's going to get overly excited about that. Then you have your closing costs went up a little bit, but check out your cash to close. You were told you had to bring $16,054. Now that we're here, you only have to bring $14,147.26. That's good for the buyer. That's good for the borrower. That gives them about $1,500, give or take, that they can go get, paint or cleaning supplies or whatever to help with their new home. Page 167 of the CD, again, kind of breaks down all the buyers and sellers' debits. Help them arrive to their cost to other people, their cost to third parties. Page 168. The top of page 168, I love it. It does a very nice side-by-side comparison. This is what we told you at the loan estimate. This is what we're telling you in the final. And then the big question is, did this change? So if we don't remember what the loan estimate said a couple weeks ago, then we can do this nice side-by-side comparison to see it here. And again, This is still 3 days prior to settlement. So if your buyer has any questions, this is the time to ask. If there's something on here that they're not sure about, this is why TRID requires the borrower to have a 3-day review of that CD so they have time to look at it, so they have time to make sure that they're okay with it. The rest of 167, you could draw a line down the middle of the page. The buyers are on the left and the sellers are on the right. So we take into account all of their debits and credits. And then at the very bottom on the left, we have how much your buyer has to bring to closing. And at the bottom on the right, we have how much your seller's going to get. When you and I are given a CD to review from the attorney, we will be getting pages 167 and 168. When you guys come see me in post licensing, that's what we're going to do together, pages 167 and 168. That's not what we're doing in pre-licensing. The whole point of TRID, remember, TRID is to protect the consumer. And I think it's really important that we remember that the consumer in this transaction is the borrower, because they are the ones originating the new loan. The seller's not getting a loan. The seller is not protected by TRID. The consumer that we are protecting in this transaction is TRID. And one way is the buyer. And one way that we can protect the buyer, since TRID, post the housing market crash, buyers and sellers can no longer sit at the settlement table together. They need to be separate. Prior to TRID, we were all in the room all at the same time. TRID said, it is none of the seller's business what the buyer's numbers are. So now if your seller's going to settlement, the attorney will take the seller back to the little room to do their thing first, because they only take like 15, 20 minutes. And then when they leave, then they'll go get the buyer and their agent to go back in the little room to do their thing. The other thing that you're not going to see in the real world, I know we're looking at it on page 167 and 168, but that's just to simplify it for an example for you guys. In the real world, we're going to have 2 CDs, one for the buyer and one for the seller. TRID doesn't care if the seller sees the buyer CDs. What they do care about is, that the buyer sees the sellers. TRID doesn't care if the buyer sees the seller's CDs. What TRID cares about is that the seller doesn't see the buyer's numbers. So keeping those separate. Remember, we're protecting the buyer in this transaction because they're the ones originating the new loan. Brokers, when attorneys send out the CD, they will often send us both of them, whether you're representing both parties or not. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. If I receive it, I have a duty to review it, whether it's my client or not. I also have a duty to make sure that I just don't hit forward and send it to both parties. So what if I am a single agent, dual agent? I'm going to get them both, I guarantee you that, but I need to make sure that I do not send the seller the buyer CD. So don't just hit forward and start sending that thing out. You need to take the extra step, the caution, to make sure that only the buyer sees their CD and the seller sees theirs. We've got to keep that separate. Questions or comments on that?
If a case that happen, if you are represent both sides, what will happen like in the real world? I say in the
there's penalties with TRID. So, and I don't know what would happen. But I do know that TRID is protecting the buyer. And if you violate that, then there may be a violation there with TRID. I don't know why the attorneys do what they do. I wish they didn't, but they will. They'll send them to both brokers, and that's fine. We just need to make sure that we're only showing our client their CD. Questions on the loan estimate or the closing disclosure?
I have a question.
Yes.
What's the
Yes.
rule of thumb? I've seen it different ways. That for instance, pest inspection survey is paid at settlement, or is it, could they pay it in advance? I guess that's just, you just got to keep good notes or again, is it a rule of thumb that it's done at closing, or how is that?
Most inspectors, surveyors, most of them will allow the buyer to pay for the service at settlement because they understand, especially if this is a first-time home buyer, they may not have a lot of extra money laying around. So most of them will say, I'll do the service. Not all of them, you guys hear me. I did not just tell you all of them, but most of them will allow the buyer to pay at settlement. So Ariana, what's going to happen is they'll come in and do the home inspection, and then they're going to email the invoice to the buyer and to the broker. The broker then has a responsibility to forward that invoice to the closing attorney to make sure that it gets on the closing disclosure, to make sure that that home inspector gets paid. With that being said, many of them will also say, if you pay for cash today, I'll knock off 10%. So if the buyer can pay for it ahead of time, they might get a deal, they might get a discount. But if they can't, then we need to make sure that we're getting that invoice to the attorney so they can add that to the closing disclosure. And if we go back real quick to page 167, you can see there, I got a, one of those columns is called borrower paid at closing. So I got a pest inspection fee, I got a survey fee, I got a home inspection fee. You can see that the buyer's paying for those services at closing. Now, with that being said, you may come across a home inspector that says, no, I'm not doing it if I don't get paid. It's at their discretion. But they also know they may not get all the business because, again, buyers just don't often have that money laying around because they're getting ready to buy a house. So most of them will allow us, it's kind of like rolling it all into their closing costs. But again, you guys, what we need to know about that, it's my responsibility to make sure that the closing attorney gets that invoice. And then when I get the CD to review, I need to make sure that that home inspection fee is on the invoice. If I've been given invoices, I have a duty to verify that. Other things on the closing disclosure that I can verify. I can verify the sales price. I can verify the due diligence amount, the earnest money, seller paid closing costs, home warranty. Where am I getting that information? How am I verifying that what's on the CD is correct? What am I looking at to tell me if it's right or not?
Contract.
Yeah.
Contract.
Yeah. So when you get that CD to review, the first thing I want you to do is go back to your file and pull out the contract. I don't know about y'all, but 6 weeks ago when we went under contract, I can't remember the specifics about that. So go pull out the contract. Did you have any amendments? Did you change the purchase price? Make sure that you remember to send the amendment to the closing attorney. Invoices I've received. We're getting ready to prorate. I can pick up my calculator and make sure that the prorated amounts are right. I cannot verify the lender's fees. I was not privy to the conversation that the borrower and the lender had. I don't know what the lender's charging the borrower. I can't verify that. However, once you do enough transactions, you kind of see a range. You see what's normal. Normal is about, 0.5% to 2.5%, 3%. If you see a loan origination fee for 12%, your little red flag needs to go up. You need to ask some questions. So hear me, I'm not responsible for verifying all of the CD, the accuracy of the whole thing, but I am responsible for verifying what I can, what I have access to, what I'm privy to. Other questions so far?
And that is the loan estimate, where you find that part, lender charge, and what part exactly you find it, you find?
It's gonna be, I'll see, on the loan estimate, it's on page 164. In the first column there, it says A, loan costs.
Okay,
So there's your loan originate, that points, there's your discount points, your application fee. And then
okay,
on
is
our, on 167, it's again in A, the origination charges.
it's under underwriting fee? This is the,
If the lender's charging an underwriting fee, yep.
okay,
They all don't. Some do, some don't. Some roll it into their origination fee. Yep, they're all different. So
got
I
it.
don't know, but I should be able to look at that. Yeah, that looks about normal. If it doesn't, then I just need to ask questions. I need to call the lender and say, hey, is that number, is that figure on A2 right? It looks a little high to me. So again, you guys, it's here just to kind of peruse, get a feel for it. Like I said, we'll do a deep dive in post licensing. If you happen, many times you guys come to post licensing and you've already had your first closing, and that's so exciting because now we can talk about it in post licensing. But if you're going to go to closing before you go to post licensing, if you're going to go to post licensing and then go to closing, you need to get with your BIC. Your first couple transactions, you need to get with your BIC that'll help you review these CDs, help you know what you're looking for. That'll kind of pave the path for you for the rest of your career. So now we get to do some calculations. Big part of the calculations is proration. Now, prorating is prorating. So we're going to take that expense, that shared expense, such as property taxes, HOA dues, and rent. I'll be honest, interim interest should not be here under prorations because it's not a proration. But we are going to talk about interim interest. And we're going to pick calculators up and calculate all of these. We're also going to talk about calculations that relate to the closing disclosure. So I don't think I want to do that tonight. So we'll figure that out. But we'll have that to look forward to on Tuesday, where we will do our mini closing disclosure. We're going to look at all the buyer's debits and all the buyer's credits. And we're going to figure out debits minus credits tells us how much your buyer has to bring to closing. I do have a little cheat sheet that I'm going to share with you guys before we leave tonight. In the hopes that you will look it over before Tuesday, because that'll help prepare us to do these closing disclosures. That'll help prepare us to do these mini CDs. So we'll see that before we leave tonight. And then once we're done calculating, then we're going to make sure that we're clear on our responsibilities for these closing disclosures. Because again, you guys, our responsibilities are old car. These are these duties that we owe our clients, that A in accounting. So getting into the math, there's the real world, and then there's pre-licensing world. Where are we? Pre-licensing world. Is everybody with me? They're going to do things different in the real world than we're getting ready to do it. Do I have your attention? Welcome to pre-licensing world. In pre-licensing world, every single month has 30 days. 30 times 12 is 360 days in the year. Every single month has 30 days. So in pre-licensing world, how many days are in February?
30.
30. In pre-licensing world, how many days are in October?
30.
We don't get Halloween in pre-licensing world, do we? Every single month has 30 days. Once you come see me in post-licensing, once you get out in the real world, you're going to use the actual calendar days. But the thinking is by dealing with 30-day month, 360-day year, it does make the math a little bit. This way you guys don't have to worry about how many days are in August. You don't have to worry about that till you get to post-licensing. And if you take post-licensing with me, we'll cover that. Because I don't want you to miss the question because you know how many days are in April. Right? So we'll definitely take care of that. Everybody good so far? 30-day month, 360-day year. So let's talk about prorations. Proration is just taking a shared expense and splitting it between the parties. Remember, the parties being the buyer and the seller. So things that we typically see prorated. This year's property taxes is going to be a shared expense. If the seller never paid 2024 taxes, that is entirely on the seller. That's going to be part for them to pay off as part of their sales costs. If the sale involves personal property, maybe we negotiated an outside bill of sale for the boat. The personal property taxes this year will be a proration. Any HOA dues will be prorated. HOA dues may be monthly, they may be quarterly, they may be annually. The problems will have to tell us. And then if there's a tenant in place with rent, this month's rent will be prorated. So we're taking this shared expense and we're going to make it fair between the parties. Somebody is going to owe somebody some money. Now, we're not going to have one party cut a check to the other and say, here you go, man, here's my portion of our taxes. It's all going to get hashed out and settled in the closing disclosure. If the buyer has a credit, that's that much money they'll have to bring to closing. The seller will have to pay more closing costs, right? We're going to hash it all out on the closing disclosure. The whole idea, or a big part of the idea of settlement, is to finalize or settle everything between the buyer and the seller. So we want to have everything taken care of today. When we get up and leave that table, there should be no matters left between the buyer and the seller, unless the parties agree that something needs to be worked out after settlement. So we're going to take care of these shared expenses. We're going to take care of these prorations. Some terminology we're going to see. We've already mentioned. We have our debits and our credits. A debit is an amount to be paid. It's money that you owe. A debit is an amount to be paid. A credit is money you have coming in. Both parties have debits and credits. And that little cheat sheet I just mentioned spells out both parties' debits and credits. I'm going to give you the buyer's debits and credits, and I'm going to give you the seller's debits and credits. Why am I going to give you the seller's debits and credits? Because the problems like to give you that information, and when they're asking how much does your buyer have to bring to closing, those are called distractions. So we need to make sure that we can identify the distractions and not debit or credit the buyer for the sellers. We need to identify, make sure we're aware of both. I think thinking of debits and credits, we can always think about our own wallets. Y'all ever feel like you have more debits than credits on the regular, right? So debit's money you owe, it's money coming out. A credit is money that you have coming in. When we prorate, when we have that shared expense, somebody has to be responsible for the day of closing. And in North Carolina, we consider the seller responsible for the day of closing, which means the seller will pay today's property taxes. The seller will pay today's HOA dues, and the seller will keep today's rent. So unless we're told otherwise, the seller is responsible for the day of closing. I always remember it this way. When we woke up this morning, when our alarms went off this morning, who owned the property? The seller.
Seller.
Yep. And at some point today, fingers crossed, that deed's going to change hands. So when we wake up tomorrow, now who owns the property? Today they're the buyer, tomorrow they're the owner. So because when we woke up this morning, the seller was the owner, we're going to consider them responsible for the day of settlement, day of closing when we prorate. Good so far? All right, take our last break, grab your calculators. When we come back, we're going to prorate. We're back. All right. Taking attendance. All right, so some property tax prorations. I got a couple scenarios. There's a couple different ways that property taxes can be prorated, and a lot of it revolves around September 1st. What does that date, September 1st, mean to you?
Do?
Taxes.
Taxes are due.
Property taxes.
September 1st is when taxes become due and payable. So we learned about taxes back in Unit 3. You know, they put the lien on the property on January 1st. They set the tax rate in July. The bill is mailed in August. The tax is due and payable on September 1st. If we have a closing before September 1st, we don't know what the tax bill is for this year yet. So if we have a closing before September 1st, the best we can do is rely on last year's taxes. This year's may not be the same as last year's. It's not going to be that much, maybe more or less, but it's not going to be that much, shouldn't be that much for either party to get excited. So first off, when we're prorating property taxes, we obviously need to know when settlement is and whether or not it's before or after September 1st. If closing is before September 1st, taxes for this year have not been paid. There's no way that they have been paid because they're not due yet. If closing is before September 1st, the problem may not tell you that they've not been paid, but we know that they have not. Yes? Yes. So we're going to closing on February 6th or whatever before September 1st. The problem may or may not tell you. So unpaid means that the buyer will be responsible for the tax bill later in the year. Now, it does not say the buyer will pay them because they're going to come out of the buyer's escrow if they have a lender. The lender will pay them on their behalf. But the buyer will be responsible, which means we need to have the seller pay the buyer for their portion, for their period of time at settlement. So when the bill does become payable, the buyer's already collected from the seller. So when I prorate, you guys know me by now, and you know I'm a visual person. I like my pictures. And when I prorate, the first thing I like to do is draw it out so I can see what I'm prorating. And what I'm looking at is this year's tax bill. So the tax bill is for the fiscal year. What's going to divide the year is the day we go to closing. So let's go to closing today. The seller owns the property the front part of the year. The buyer will own the property the latter part of the year. Before I ever pick up a calculator, just by drawing the picture, who has the bigger responsibility of taxes this year? Who's going to pay more this year?
The buyer.
Buyer. So if we can look at that before you ever touch a calculator, you might be able to eliminate an answer choice before you ever do math. Is that good news? Do we like that? So drawing it out, it allows us to see, unless closing is like smack dab in the middle of the year, it allows us to see who has the bigger responsibility. And we can clearly see that the buyer is going to have the bigger responsibility. But the seller owes the buyer for their portion. We're going to settle this between the buyer and the seller now. Could y'all imagine a world that we lived in where the tax bill came out in September and the buyer called the former owner and said, hey man, our tax bill is due. Give me some money. And the former owner is going to like laugh and then hang up the phone, right? They're never going to be able to collect from the seller. So we're going to settle things. We're going to finalize things now. Because the seller is paying the buyer, we need to figure out how much the seller owes the buyer. And we're first going to do that by counting the number of days that the seller is responsible. So I got 30 days in January and 6 days in February, which means the seller's responsibility for this year is 36 days. They have 36 days of taxes that they owe the buyer. Either the problem will give you the annual taxes, or they will give you the information you need to find the annual taxes. Refresher from Unit 2, when we calculated annual taxes. Once we have the annual tax bill, we take that annual tax bill and divide it by the number of days in pre-licensing world. So we divide it by 360, and that gives us daily taxes. We take the daily taxes times the number of days, and we're going to have 2 entries on the closing disclosure. Anything paid before September 1st or unpaid before September 1st is going to shake out as a debit to the seller and a credit to the buyer. In normal speak, the seller owes the buyer for 36 days of taxes. And because we're talking about the seller paying the buyer for their portion, when we prorate, it's a debit to one party and a credit to the other for the same amount. Put real estate aside for a second. Just put it off to the side for a second. Let's say I owe you money and I'm going to hand you cash. When I hand you cash, it's a debit coming from me, right? It's a debit coming out of my wallet. When you take that cash, it's a credit to you. It's money going into your wallet. And what changed hands didn't change. It was for the same amount. So a true proration is a debit to one party, a credit to the other for the same amount. And in this scenario, if closing is before September 1st, we know taxes are unpaid, and it will be a debit to the seller and a credit to the buyer. Questions on this scenario? Then we have scenarios where closing is after September 1st, on or after September 1st for pre-licensing world. And there's a couple different ways that that can be handled. So now we have closing after September 1st and taxes have been paid. That means the seller has received the tax bill and they have went ahead and paid the tax bill for the year. So because the seller has already paid, the buyer is going to reimburse the seller for their portion of the taxes. September 1st, closing is after September 1st. Taxes have been paid. So again, let's draw it out, see what we got. I got my annual tax bill. Let's go to closing on just a random day. Let's go on November 23rd. Seller owns the front part of the year. Buyer owns the last part of the year. Don't touch a calculator. Who owes more in taxes this year? Who has the bigger responsibility?
The seller.
Seller.
The seller. So again, now go to your answer choices. If one answer choice has the buyer paying more, then you know that's not an answer choice. You've just given, you went from a 25% chance of getting it right to a 33% chance of getting it right. Do we like those odds better? What do y'all want to go to Vegas on, 25% or 33%? So whenever you can eliminate an answer choice, you're getting better odds. So now we know that the seller's paid the bill, and what's happening now, the seller has paid the bill for the whole year, but they're not going to own the property for the whole year. So they want to collect from somebody, right? And the only person that they can collect from is the buyer at settlement. So now we have to count forward in the timeline. The buyer's responsibility will be the day after to the end of the year. The seller will pay taxes or be responsible for taxes on the day of closing, the 23rd. Whenever you're counting forward on the timeline, there's a little trick I want you guys to do to make sure that we get this right, because it's really easy to look at that and see 6 days. And if that's what you did, you just missed the whole problem, not because you don't know what you're doing, but because you didn't count right. So I have a highly sophisticated method to make sure that we're getting our days right. And how we're going to do that when we count forward, we're going to count it out on our fingers. So I'm going to count November 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, and 30. There are 7 days left in November, plus 30 days in December, which means the buyer's responsibility is for 37 days. Again, you take the annual tax bill, divide it by 360 to get daily taxes. And then we multiply the daily taxes by the number of days. Normal people would say buyer owes the seller. Closing disclosure says debit the buyer, credit the seller.
So you're saying divide the tax bill by 360 days.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're gonna take that monthly balance and divide it by the rest of the 37 days.
It's daily. So dividing the annual tax bill by 360 gives me daily taxes. And then I can time that by 37 to get how much the buyer owes the seller at settlement. Yeah, Ebony.
So you started counting on the 24th instead of the 23rd, right?
Correct.
Why exactly?
Because the seller is going to pay taxes on the 23rd. The seller is responsible for the day of closing.
Oh,
So
okay.
they get to pay today's taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Tomorrow, the buyer gets to start paying taxes.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So after September 1st, scenario 1, taxes have been paid prior to settlement. Good? Don't worry, I got stuff for you, practice for you guys. Never fear. The other scenario, closing after September 1st. We're going to closing after September 1st, and taxes have not been paid. After September 1st, taxes have not been paid. In this case, we're not going to do a true proration. In this case, we're going to do something called a double debit. The seller will have a debit for their responsibility of taxes. The buyer will have a double debit for their responsibility of taxes. And then the attorney is going to collect from both parties, and the attorney is going to send in the amount for this year's tax bill. The attorney is going to pay the taxes on behalf of the parties. Does the county care where the money comes from for the property? No, they don't care. They just want to get paid the property taxes. Usually this happens where we see this most is when closing is like in December or something. And then this way we don't have to worry about the lender or the buyer, anybody doing it. The attorney will take care of it, and then there won't be delinquent taxes, and they'll be taken care of. So again, we draw it out. Annual. And we can go to closing. Let's go on the 23rd again. That was a good date. Seller owns front part of the year. Buyer owns the latter part of the year. When we're double debiting, I find it easier to calculate the person with the shortest amount of time, which in this case would be the buyer. So again, we're going to say the buyer's responsibility is the day after to the end of the year. And we're going to count. Y'all, do not look at that and see there's 6 days left in November. Again, you've just missed the whole problem because you didn't count your days right. So the tried and true method I have for you is just count it out. Count out the rest of that month. So 24, 25, 60. So I got 7 days left in November, 30 days in December. So the buyer's responsibility is 37 days, which means if I take 360 minus 37, we can see that the seller is responsible for 323 days. Take your annual tax bill, divide it by 360 to get daily. Then you can figure out how much the buyer's is. Once you have the buyers and once you have daily, you can figure out both parties. Or the other thing you could do, once you figure out what the buyer's is, I'm just going to make a number up real quick. Let's just pretend our annual tax bill is $1,200. So I take 1,200 divided by 360 and I get $3.33 a day. So I would take 37 days times $3.37. And I get $123.21. That's a debit to the buyer. And then I can take the annual tax bill minus what the buyer owes. And that gives us the seller's responsibility, debit the seller. So both parties are paying their fair share. The buyer's going to pay, debit the buyer 123.21, debit the seller 1076.79. Nobody's paying each other. They're both paying their fair share of taxes. The attorney will send in one check for this year's annual taxes. So that shakes out a double debit is a debit to the seller, debit to the party, and it is not the same amount. It is going to be a different amount. The seller will have their debit and the buyer will have theirs. So 2 scenarios if closings after September 1st. Paid after September 1st and taxes are paid, we're going to do a debit the buyer, credit the seller. After September 1st, taxes are unpaid, double debit. The problem will have to tell you after September 1st if taxes have been paid or not. Questions? Good so far? All right, so let's sum it all up. Step 1, you're going to calculate the days for the buyer or the seller, whomever the debit is for. If it's debit the seller, we'll count their days. If it's debit the buyer, if it's a double debit, we're going to calculate whichever one has the smaller which is going to be the buyer. So calculate the days, whomever the debit is for. Then you're going to take the tax year, the tax bill for the year, divide it by 360. That'll give you daily taxes. Annual taxes divided by 360 gives us daily taxes. And then we're going to take the number of days times the daily rate. And that's going to let us see what the amount is. Debit one party, credit the other, or each party's double debit, for each party's double debit. Questions? Before we pick up the calculators, as a reminder, we're going to have to find annual taxes. So if you're a T-Bar fan, we got our annual taxes as part of our assessed value and the tax rate. Also, as a reminder, with Unit 3 was a long time ago, right? Also, as a reminder, with the tax rate, ad valorem is the tax rate per 100, the amount per 100. A mil is 1/1000th. So you're looking for the assessed value. You're looking for either ad valorem or mil. They'll give you one or the other. They will not give you both. So you're going to first calculate the annual taxes. Then you're going to divide the annual taxes by 360 to get daily, to figure out your proration. Is everybody ready? All right. Tell me in a chat, A, B, C, or D, and then we'll talk about it. You guys keep working while you're finishing up. Gotta grab my whiteboard. You got one more minute and then we'll talk about it. So let's see what we got. A buyer is purchasing a property for $280,000. It's closing on April 17th. The assessed value is 85% of the sales price. The tax rate is 1.35 per 100. What is the tax proration entry if taxes are unpaid by the seller? First off, did the problem need to tell you that they were unpaid? Did it have to tell you that? No. Why?
Because it's April 17th.
Because it's before September 1st. So anything before September 1st, we know that it is unpaid. So the first thing I have to do is find my annual taxes. So we know our T-bar or whatever method you prefer. Autopilot's getting in my way. Okay. So we know our T-bar. We know what I'm solving for is my annual taxes. So that's my X here. The bottom left is the assessed value. So I know my purchase price is $280,000. I know the assessed value is 85% of the sales price. What's that word of tell me to do?
Divide.
Multiply. That word of tells me to multiply. So I take 280,000 times 85%. Oops, sorry about that. 80,000 times, there it is, 85%. And I get an assessed value of $238,000. That's what's going to go in the bottom left. My assessed value is 85% of the sales price. Then we got to find the tax rate. What's that fancy word per tell me to do?
Multiply.
Divide.
Per tells me to divide. So I take my taxes, my 1.35 divide by 100, and I get a tax rate of 0.0135. And that's what goes here, 0.0135. The up down line in the T-bar means multiply. So I take 238,000 times 0.0135, and I get annual taxes, an annual tax bill of $3,213. Questions so far? Step one, these are multi-step problems, right? So step one, we got to figure out what the tax bill is. Questions so far?
Julie, would it work the same if you did 238,000 divided by 100? Got
Yes.
the answer and then times it by the 1 point? Okay. I was
Yep.
just didn't want to start new bad habits.
Nope, nope, that would work as well. Okay. So now that I know my annual tax bill, I know I got to break this down to daily. So I take my annual tax bill and divide it by 360. So I get daily taxes of $8, 8 point, right? Yeah, 925. Again, you guys be careful with rounding. The suggestion is you go out 3 decimal places until the end. If you want to do 2, that's fine. If you get off a little for rounding, you can see the answer choices aren't so close that you're going to miss by rounding alone. What I say is just don't get carried away. Give yourself at least change. Go out at least 2, but the suggestion is to go out 3. So my calculator says 8.925 daily taxes. How much taxes are each day? So now if we take our timeline, we have closing. My annual taxes for the timeline are January 1st to the end of the year. And what divides the timeline is the day of closing, which is April 17th. Seller owns the front part of the year. Buyer will own the latter part of the year. Taxes are unpaid, which means at some point later in the year, the buyer will be responsible for the whole year. So if the buyer's going to pay the whole year, the question I always ask myself when I prorate is who owes who?
Buyer or the seller?
So the buyer's
Seller
gonna
owes
pay
the buyer.
whole bill. That's right. So the seller owes the buyer. And in CD verbiage, that shakes out to a debit the seller, credit the buyer. When you figure that out, aren't there a couple choices that I can eliminate? Because once we figure out who owes who, right here, we could rule out C and D. You just went from 25% chance of getting it right to a 50% chance of getting it right. Now we're really going to Vegas, aren't we, on those odds? So again, take time. Y'all, these are a lot of steps. These are big problems. But take time to think about what you're doing. And anything you can eliminate is going to give you better chance. So the seller owes the buyer, which means we now to figure out the seller's responsibility. And the seller's responsible for 30 days in January, 30 days in February, 30 days in March, and 17 days in April. So the seller's total responsibility is 107 days. If the seller, if daily taxes are 8.925, the seller owes for 107 days, then we're getting 954.98. And since we're instructed to round, we know that the answer that we're looking for is A. And what we're saying, put the CD aside for a second. What we're saying is that the seller owes the buyer for their portion of the taxes, which is $954.98. On the CD, on the CD, it's going to show up as a debit the seller for $954.98, and it's going to show up as a credit to the buyer for $954.98. You second guess yourself. That's good. Questions? How'd we do? Thumbs ups, and that's all right. It's your first one. Don't be too hard on yourself. It's your first one. Don't be too hard on yourself. This is what I know about proration. You're going to see it on our mini CD when we come together on Tuesday. The other thing I know about proration is there's a really good chance you could see a standalone proration problem. So in addition to seeing it on the mini CD, you might have another question that could look very similar to this. So if you practice prorating, then you might get yourself a couple answer test questions. Remind me again, or I can remind you, whichever. How much math do you have?
7.
7 or 5%. So I ask that you give it a shot because, guys, this is real world stuff. This is stuff that we need to get a handle on at some point. So why not start today? With that being said, don't spend all your study time because you're only looking at 5% of your exam on math.
There's 7 on the class exam.
And your state exam. So if you want to use the math to up your grade, awesome. If you want to focus on agency and contracts, you guys hopefully know where you are at this point. Questions about the problem? Can I erase? Everybody have it? Okay. The only way I know to get good at something, do it again. Tell me in a chat, A, B, C, or D. We got one more minute and then we'll look at it. So I got a buyer purchasing a property for 180,000 with an assessed value of 90%. Tax rate is 16 mils. Closing is September 3rd. What is the tax proration entry if the seller has paid the entire bill? So again, first off, we need to find what our annual tax bill is. So I'm going to solve for X. The number in the bottom left is my assessed value. So I have a purchase price of 180,000. Assessed value is 90%, with an assessed value of 90% of the purchase price. We're going to say 90%. 180,000 times 90% gives me an assessed value of 162,000. And that's what's going to go in the bottom left. Then we got to figure out our tax rate. This problem gave us mils. Mil is of per 1,000. So 16 divided by 1,000 gives me a mil rate of 0.016. And that's what goes here. Up, down line in the T-bar means multiply. So 162,000 times 0.016 gives me annual taxes of $2,592. So the tax bill for this year is going to be $2,592. We know we got to go ahead and break this down into daily. So at any point, there's no wrong order. Take our annual tax bill divided by 360 to get a daily tax bill of $7.20 a day. Questions so far? Now we look at our timeline. Talking about annual taxes. So we're going to look at for the year. Closing is September 3rd. Seller owns the front part of the year. Buyer owns the latter part of the year. So now we go back to the problem. The seller has paid the annual tax bill. So the whole bill has been paid. So the question I want you to ask yourself, and you write this down if you haven't, question I want you to ask yourself is, who owes who? The seller's paid the bill for the whole year. So who owes who?
The buyer owes the seller.
The buyer owes the seller, or if we're speaking CD verbiage, it would shake out as a debit to the buyer, credit to the seller. The buyer owes the seller. So we know that we're doing a debit to the buyer, credit to the seller. Questions? Now we got to figure out how much the buyer owes the seller. So back to our timeline, the buyer's responsibility starts the day after and goes to the end of the year. I've already counted it out, so I'm not going to go through that again. When closing's at the beginning of the month, it gets a lot of fingers counting. But I got 27 days left in September, plus 30 days in October, 30 days in November, and 30 days in December, which means the buyer owns the property. The buyer has a responsibility of taxes of 117 days this year. So I have my daily taxes of $7.20 for 117 days, which means the buyer will owe the seller $842.40, or D. Debit the buyer, credit the seller, $842. Two entries. Debit the buyer, $842. Debit the seller, or credit the seller. Debit the buyer, credit the seller, $842. Who owes who? Honestly, you guys, for me, when I prorate, figuring out who gets the debit, who gets the credit is the most difficult part for me. But if I can pause, just pause for a second, look at your picture, and then ask yourself, who owes who? Once you figure that, or for me, once I figure that out, questions?
So for this one, we just still want to make sure we count the days. So since the seller paid, we want to make sure we count the days remaining for the buyer, for the buyer
buyer's
portion.
responsibility, right? Yep. So Tiffany, when I'm prorating debit one party, credit to the other, the days that I'm counting is the party that gets the debit because they're the ones that owe for their portion. Does the seller feel whole now? They pay the tax bill, but they're moving out on September 3rd. At some point, the seller's going, whoa, 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 whoa. Somebody owes me some money. Who owes them money? The other party to the transaction, the buyer. And that's what we're doing. We're taking that shared expense and making it fair. All right, don't go anywhere yet. I got a few things. Can I erase? Everybody good? Demarius, is that a hand or is that were you waving at me? Okay, okay. All right, so let me clear this out. If it's paid on September 1st, then the bill, we're going to say for pre-licensing world, the bills come out. So September 1st is our deadline. So September 1st and later, the bill has come out. And then we just need to determine if they've been paid or unpaid. The difference is debit the buyer, credit the seller, or double debit. So next week, you guys, we're going to finish. Well, first off, I got Becky coming on Tuesday. So don't forget, I got Becky coming. If I go back to the online learning system, I'm sorry, if I go back to Google Drive, I got these two documents in here about the Proctor Free. Becky's going to come and give us a demonstration. We got like 10, 15 minutes for Becky. So I think if we can look at these documents before Tuesday, then that's going to help with our time with Becky on Tuesday. Everybody good with that? She's doing this out of the kindness of her heart. So please take a minute to look over these so we're prepared for her on Tuesday so we can see what to expect on our exam the following weekend. Everybody good? Okay. Also in Google Drive, there is a document called Buyer and Seller Debits and Credits. Now we're going to talk about this next week, but I really think it would help us if we can look over it this weekend. I got various things that would be the buyer single entry items. So here's some credits to the buyer. Here's some debits to the buyer. I got seller single entry items, debits to the seller. I got things that the buyers may pay outside of closing, which means I'm not going to charge them at closing, which means if they show up, they're a distraction. They've already paid for it. We don't need them to pay for it again. I got some double entry items. So the sales price, we're going to see twice. The due diligence fee we'll see twice. And then we have our prorated items, whether or not they've been paid or unpaid. So we're going to look at this as we get to our closing disclosure. We're going to do a few more proration problems, make sure we're good on that. After chapter 11, we're going to put 12 off to the side for now. And after 11, we're going to get into 13. And after 13, we're going to do 15. I will come back and pick up 12 and 14 later. I'm not worried about 12 and 14. I don't want you to worry about 12 and 14. So next week is 11, 13, and 15. And then we will get the few pieces from those skipped units. But we are not worried about 9, 12, and 14. So next week, 11, 13, 15. And that'll be that. Y'all enjoy your cram course on Saturday. Jane's really good. She's going to give you some great information. Remember, I'm here to answer questions. Send me screenshots. Let me know what I can do to help, especially as we're getting closer and closer to that exam. Do not hesitate to reach out to me. Please. Please. Nothing hurts me more than when y'all show up after the test talking about, I never really understood that to begin with. Let's understand it beforehand. Fair enough? All right. Y'all have a great weekend. We'll see you guys on Tuesday.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.